Yes, but he's already paid back the taxes. He's paid back, I believe, all the penalties. He's already made his amends with the IRS. Normally, under circumstances like that, where somebody's addicted, there is a good shot that the person wouldn't even be prosecuted in the first instance. So to me, as a criminal defense lawyer, as well as having been a prosecutor, I think you just have to go in, take your lumps, and argue that this is a case for probation. I mean, I think that is the approach he should be taking at this point, and should have taken before.
We saw a statement. Well, and of course, there was a plea deal at one point in this case, and I want to ask you about the statement from the President of the United States. He's already said he will not pardon Hunter Biden. He says, "I will accept the outcome of this case and will continue to respect the judicial process as Hunter considers an appeal." Will there be an appeal? What's their case going to be?
I think there is going to be an appeal based on the Second Amendment. It's hard to believe that that's going to go very far or it's going to be successful. But I suppose he's got nothing to lose by doing that. Even after he's sentenced, an appeal will go before the circuit court and then possibly the Supreme Court. I just find it hard to believe that an appellate court is going to say that this statute is some way violative of the Second Amendment.
Fascinating. We're spending time with Nick Ackerman, as he just said, a criminal defense attorney, but also noted former Watergate prosecutor. As we consider the last 24 hours in which Donald Trump sat down for his first interview with a probation officer, that's not getting any conversation today, Nick, because this Hunter Biden news just broke. But I wonder your thought on the way this was handled. He was allowed to do this virtually, and he was allowed to have his lawyer in the room, which we understand is not typical for most defendants in a criminal case like this. Should he have been afforded those exceptions?
Well, first of all, I think the interview by Zoom is not necessarily a big exception. Since the pandemic, I know that there are others who have also had that ability to be able to be interviewed by probation over Zoom. So I don't see that being a big deal. The fact that his lawyer was there, normally in the federal system, the lawyer is present for those kinds of conversations. So I don't, I know the judge allowed this exception based on the request by the attorneys. I don't see this being a big deal. And look, he's being treated just like anybody else. He's being interviewed by probation. The big issue, I suppose, with probation is going to be whether he essentially evinces any kind of remorse for what he did, which it's hard to believe he would based on the statements he's been making since the conviction. So I don't see how this interview is going to help him anyway. If anything, I think it's going to be a big negative that's going to be given to the judge for sentencing purposes.
How about that? I ask you this because there was a statement from a group of public defender groups, including the Legal Aid Society, the Bronx Defenders, and said these exceptions made for Trump are not typically afforded to low-income defendants. I think the idea here is if I had a public defender, they would not be allowed to join me in that room. Whether that moves the needle for you at all. Nick, where are you on potential sentencing? Because to your point, that's where this interview is heading.
Yeah, well, obviously, I saw that statement, and look, I don't think materially it makes a difference that Trump did it by Zoom or that he had his lawyer present. I think the real question comes down to just what you just asked. What is the sentence going to be? And I would be surprised if he does not get some jail time, mainly because Michael Cohen, the witnesses who testified against him, served 3 years as a result of this crime in part. Also, Alan Weisselberg, who was one of the architects of setting up this false document scheme with Trump's approval, has already is going to be, at the end of the day, have served 6 months at Rikers Island for other offenses. So I think it's going to be hard for the judge to justify why those two people serve time and Donald Trump is not. So I think that's his big problem here, is that there are others that were as culpable and less culpable than him that were involved in this that have spent some time in jail.
Wow. July 11th, right? I don't know if you're busy, Nick, but we're going to be calling you. Great to see you again. Nick Ackerman with us on Bloomberg. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, the fastest show in politics. On this day, Hunter Biden becomes the first son of a president of the United States to be convicted on criminal charges. We'll have much more ahead on the fastest show in politics. This is Bloomberg.
It's 12:20 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got stocks trading mix, little change on NASDAQ right now, up barely, up by about 1 point. S&P in the red, down 17, down 0.3%. Dow Industrials down 290, a decline of 0.7%. 10-year, 4.45% with a 2-year yielding 4.85%. Gold down $3 the ounce, down 0.2%. 23.07, while West Texas Intermediate crude oil up 0.4%. 78.02 for a barrel of WTI. A slide in banks weighing on stocks ahead of the Fed decision tomorrow. Among some of those bank names, J.P. Morgan Chase down 2.5%. We've got Citigroup down 3.7%. Wells Fargo down 1.4%. GM has authorized a new $6 billion share buyback plan, is improving profitability in its primary business, and growth in EVs allow the automaker to return cash to shareholders. General Motors shares, they're advancing now. We've got GM up by just about 0.8%. Again, recapping, stocks are trading mixed. The Dow, the S&P, and the red. 17-point drop right now for the S&P, down 0.3%. Balance of power continues now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your host, Joe Matthew.
Charlie Pellet, thank you. We'll be back to Charlie a bit later on this hour to keep tabs on markets as we talk politics here on Balance of Power. Thank you for joining us for the Tuesday edition on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite radio, and on YouTube, where you can find us right now by searching Bloomberg Global News. Building shook a little bit when the Hunter headlines broke. Redhead on the terminal, Hunter Biden convicted, gun charges by a jury in Delaware. No one's surprised, we were told yesterday. Overwhelming evidence, only 3 charges. Deliberations should not take long, and here we are as we try to pick through this from a legal perspective and explore the potential political ramifications. As I already told you, we've heard from Joe Biden today saying he will stand by his son. This is a personal matter, obviously, for the Bidens. The First Lady was in the courtroom for the bulk of this roughly week-long trial. But I have an important conversation to bring you, and it's a familiar voice if you watch or listen to this program. Denver Riggleman, the former Republican congressman, former Air Force intelligence officer, former member of the House Freedom Caucus, is also a data analyst and has a firm that specializes in data forensics, and in fact went to work with as a consultant with Hunter Biden's legal team to take a look inside the laptop and follow any number of allegations that have been brought by Republicans. And Denver's with us right now. It's good to have you back, sir. I wonder your thoughts, having spent the time that you did also as a technical consultant for the January 6th committee. You actually looked inside this laptop. You've been around the horn a number of times on this, and as you've told us, you have a personal relationship, a friendship, if I can call it that, with Hunter Biden. Did you ever think that the conviction, if there was going to be one, would come from a checked box here, in this case, on a gun form?
Yeah, I mean, I think, when you look at it, first of all, it's really hard to get your arms around. I had a brother convicted of a minor drug offense that ended up being actually a felony. And you're thinking, well, it's just marijuana, but he had broken the law. And I remember the sadness in our family when he went to jail. And I can't imagine the sadness, that Hunter Biden's family has right now. But when you looked at the evidence and what had happened, regardless of the years that had passed and the effort that Hunter has put into his own life, which is extraordinary, I think when you look at the black and white language of the law, I'm not surprised at the guilty verdict, Joe. It's just not really surprising at all. And when you talk about looking in the laptop, I know it's an incredible question. I actually looked at the data supposedly from the laptop. And there's multiple laptops, which a lot of people don't know. And that's another question, another thing. But there's multiple lawsuits out there about that specific data that's supposedly from the laptop. That's why I don't get into it too much, even with idiots on Twitter and X, But I think that, they're like, well, prove the negative. It's ridiculous. But looking at, there's really no impeachment thing going to happen. We know there's no huge, there's no financial crime, stuff that's coming out of the Comer committee or things like that. That's sort of gone. But this right here is a specific charge. And I think, Joe, I think it's no surprise, to anyone that he was found guilty on this.
We got a statement both from Hunter Biden and from his attorney, Abe Lowell. We're naturally disappointed by today's verdict. Lowell writes, "We respect the jury process, and as we've done throughout this case, we'll continue to vigorously pursue all the legal challenges available to Hunter." So what will this appeal look like, or what should it look like, Denver?
It's interesting, and Joe, I'm not a lawyer. I'm, just a lowly former congressman and data analytic counterterrorism expert and company owner and distillery owner. But I think what this means, Abby Lowell's an incredible attorney. I know him personally also. I think what they're going to look at again is really how long the charges are, but almost a compassionate look at what has happened to Hunter since then. But as far as the appeals process, I think it's really going to depend on the sentencing. I'm really wondering, if Hunter gets jail time. I think it's possible he does get some jail time here. And again, what does that do with the ridiculousness that we saw before the verdict where you had the far right or people that were Trump supporters saying he was going to get off. I mean, it destroys that narrative. I don't think that makes any difference with the breathlessness of deep state and globalist conspiracy theories that seem to have, captured MAGA Joe. But I think the appeals process with Abby, he knows, where he really does know where the gaps are in a prosecutorial case and what he can exploit based on the rule of law. But think about what he said. He respects the jury process. That's really not something you got out of the Trump team on his 34 convictions. So I think it's just that stark contrast, the rule of law and individuals who respect American institutions and those who don't.
So let's get to the politics of it, Denver. That's the world in which you come from and we tend to talk about here. You mentioned some important names, or at least one of them, and James Comer. I could mention Jim Jordan as well. Everyone's asking what this means for the presidential election. I'm curious what it means for these two chairs in the Republican House who wanted to impeach Joe Biden and might be emboldened by this verdict.
If they're emboldened by a guilty verdict of a recovering addict, that really, I think it would be pretty amazing for them to try to pursue this based on the fact that the gun charge was a specific thing that Hunter Biden did that really had nothing to do with the laptop politics. It's a really specific charge, and there's so many differences, say, between the gun charge, the tax charges, and what the impeachment proceedings are. These are three huge different wickets, that they're going after. So if they try to reboot this, I think what's going to happen is what they're going to do? They're going to war game this out. There's going to be a political backlash because now you have this duplicity, right, where you have Hunter Biden being convicted and Donald Trump with his 34 counts, where the question is going to be, hold on a second. You guys certainly have failed up to this point. It was actually legal. We have a legal proceeding for this. What are you guys doing where you're trying to reboot this? We're using American taxpayer money where it's already been discredited. I think there is going to be some wargaming on that side, but we're also so close to the election, Joe. I don't know if it matters that much. I don't think the far right's going to change. I don't think there's going to be anybody else who changes their vote, to Trump. Based on the fact that they're doing this. I don't think that happens. I think the gaslighting and the deep state conspiracy theories are so entrenched in a large portion of our population. I just don't know if it matters.
We talked earlier with Nick Ackerman, the former Watergate prosecutor, who suggested that if he were giving Hunter Biden legal advice, he'd just go ahead and plead guilty in the next trial for more favorable treatment. What do you think about that?
Listen, I think for me, if you're trying to fix your life and you've done things in the past, you're talking about, offenses that happened years and years ago, I think there's a willingness or a pride to where you want to fight. It depends, I think, on what they see the sentencing again. I don't think he's going to plead guilty on the tax charges. I just don't see that happening. The fact that he paid those taxes back. I think it's going to be an interesting case. I think it's probably more complex than the gun case, to be honest. I think this was rather straightforward. I don't see him pleading guilty on those charges, or maybe some limited plea on specific charges, maybe another plea deal. But again, I just don't see if they don't offer them a plea deal, I just don't see him pleading guilty at this point. Of course, Joe, sometimes I'm right, sometimes I'm wrong, but I just don't see him I don't see him pleading guilty at this point.
It's a very insightful statement. When you're trying to fix your life, you might be more likely to fight. As we spend time with Denver Riggleman in our last minute or two here, Denver, we're going to hear from the special counsel, David Weiss. Looks like coming up top of the hour, about a half an hour from now, we're told he will not take questions. What do you think he'll say?
I think he's going to say that he's going to have to really toe the line. I think he's going to say he rejects, he respects the jury process also. But here's what I want to watch for. If it's something like nobody's above the law and it's cocksure and it's preening, I think it's going to come off as ludicrous because he is a Trump-appointed attorney. I think what they need to say is they need to respect somebody who's trying to come back from addiction and all the addicts that are out there, including members of my family who've gone through this. And I think they need to recognize that, yes, he broke the rule of law and he needs to be held accountable, but this is somebody trying to fix their life. So I would actually hope that David Weiss would go for leniency on sentencing. I don't see that happening, but I think that's the right thing to do. But, right and politics are sometimes mutually exclusive, my friend. And so it could be, it could be a cocksure preening, we knew we were right the whole time. But my guess is it won't be, because I think it comes off as gratuitous if he does that.
Well, you and I both know that everyone's family is exposed to this somehow. I refuse to believe that any family is spared this experience when it comes to addiction. I have less than a minute. Is the weaponization argument over?
Oh, no.
No.
I mean, oh no. I mean, I still think it should be over if you're sane and you have any rational thought in your pea brain, right? But I think that, honestly, I think they're going to try to find another way to slant angle this on the far right and Trump supporters. And now it's going to be always going to get out of jail time. I don't think he does, but we'll see. I hope he does. But I don't think it's really going to change the weaponization argument at all from the far right. I think they're so embedded in it and they really have no way to get out of it that they're going to try to continue it in some ridiculous conspiracy infested way.
I told you I was going to bring you a different conversation, and that's always what it is with Denver Riggleman. It's great to have you back, and I appreciate your personal insights today, Denver. You can't talk about this without feeling some level of personal impact, knowing that this is a story of addiction. It's a story of personal behavior. It's a very messy story here, if you want to read about it on the terminal, and one that the Biden family was obviously struggling with for the last week. We're going to hear from the special prosecutor, as we mentioned, coming up top of the hour. We'll have more on the political ramifications of all of this with our political panel. Rick and Jeannie are up next after we check world and national news. And for that, we turn to Nancy Lyons of the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom here in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. Hunter Biden, as you've been talking about, has been found guilty of all 3 charges in his federal firearms case. Jurors reached their verdict after about 3 hours of deliberation. He is the first child of a sitting U.S. president to be convicted of crimes. Hunter Biden still faces a separate tax crime trial in California. President Biden will be speaking this afternoon at a gun violence prevention summit hosted by Everytown for Gun Safety. Michael Bloomberg, the founder and majority owner of Bloomberg LP, the parent of Bloomberg Radio, is a donor to groups that support gun control, including Everytown for Gun Safety. Well, the president will be highlighting his efforts to rein in crime. Jeff Asher with the consulting firm AH Datalytics says recent numbers from the FBI show that violent crime has decreased in the first few months of the year.
The overall direction shows very large decline in murder and sizable declines in violent and property crime.
Overall, Asher says violent crime fell 15% in the first quarter. Voters in North Dakota today are deciding whether the state should implement an age limit for congressional office holders. The Congressional Age Limits Initiative would prevent anyone from being elected or appointed to serve in Congress if they turned 81 before the end of their would-be term. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg.
1240 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We got the Dow, the S&P, they're both lower. NASDAQ holding on to a 5-point gain of less than 0.1%. S&P down 14, drop there of 0.3%. Dow down 277, a decline of 0.7%. 10-year 4.45% with a 2-year 4.85%. Spot gold down $3 the ounce to 23.07, drop of 0.2%. And West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.7%, 78.26 per barrel of WTI. Bank stocks leading the way lower. Also, we've got the economic view on Main Street improving somewhat in May. And with that story, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
The Small Business Optimism Index is up, though it remains below the long-term average. Small firms are, for now, less downbeat about prospects for America's economy. Inflation remains the top concern. Financing is another issue. With interest rates at 2-decade highs, many lenders are being more selective. The Small Business Optimism Index is published by the National Federation for Independent Business. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
Federal Reserve policymakers now meeting. We get the decision tomorrow, 2 o'clock Wall Street time, 2:30. You can hear the news conference, 2:30 Wall Street time. You can hear the news conference on Bloomberg Radio. After the bell today, Oracle will report fiscal fourth quarter results. Investors are expecting growth in sales from its cloud infrastructure. Oracle sales trading lower ahead of earnings, down now by 0.5%. Again, recapping, stocks are mixed. S&P down 13, drop there of 0.3%. Balance of power continues now. And back we go to Washington once again. Here he is, your host, Joe Matthew.
Charlie Pellet, thank you. On another breaking news day in Delaware, in this case, Hunter Biden, as you've been hearing on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite and on YouTube, found guilty, 3 felony charges. And we're going to be hearing from the special counsel who brought those charges. David Weiss going to be making a statement in Wilmington, Delaware at the top of the hour. That's about 20 minutes from right now. When he speaks, we will bring you his comments live. He's not expected to take questions. This will be just a statement from the special counsel now that we have a verdict. Remembering that David Weiss testified in closed-door testimony not that long ago on Capitol Hill about whether he had full authority to pursue criminal charges against Hunter Biden. And here we are today. Now, we're going to talk a bit more over the course of the program about the legal implications here, the next steps. We don't have a sentencing date yet. A lot of folks are speculating on a sentence and speculating to that end on the next trial for Hunter Biden, which will likely come in the fall, assuming things don't get delayed. That's the tax evasion case that he is facing. Are there political implications? Depends who you ask and what poll you might look at. For me, I go to the signature panel at times like these. That's Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, Bloomberg Politics contributors who we know and trust and have been with us since the beginning of the Hunter Biden controversy. Great to have you both here, Jeannie. You've been talking for a bit about this. As a Democrat, I don't know if we should even do it that way, because the political implications seem pretty vague to me in what is a very personal situation for Joe Biden. You wonder, though, if this reignites or somehow re-inspires James Comer and Jim Jordan to start pursuing Joe Biden again. Are there politics here today or not?
There absolutely are. I mean, there's so much evidence of it. You mentioned the Jim Comer statement that he released. I just want to add one more to that, which is the fact that Trump's campaign issued a statement, pulled the end of it back, which wished Hunter Biden well in his recovery and addiction, then pulled the entire thing back and said they're going to wait for Donald Trump to issue a statement. And I think that just speaks to the politics here for Donald Trump's campaign, which not only has to deal with these issues of a two-tier system of justice, Trump's own history with his brother of addiction, but also the 2A community, which really, really wants Hunter Biden to appeal this decision, ironically, to the Supreme Court. So there's a lot of interweaving politics here. So cannot divorce the politics from the fact that this is obviously incredibly difficult for the family of Hunter Biden and Hunter Biden himself.
Fascinating. Rick, I don't even want to ask you a question as much as just let you bring your insights to us. How are you looking at this today, based on what we just heard from Jeannie?
Yeah, purely as a electoral issue, I think that we've seen actually some movement in the surveys over the last 2 weeks since Donald Trump's conviction, where there's no question he's gotten depressed in his vote a little bit. You know, some of these voters that were sort of Biden refugees that were going over to vote for Donald Trump look like they might be coming back. And so it's become kind of a sticky place, right, to go back to Biden. Now, whether this halts any of that movement or actually gives him some benefit. I mean, there's a outpouring in the news today about, wow, why did this ever go to trial? How horrible this is for the Biden family. They're dealing with a issue that has really haunted the family in a very extreme way. I mean, the news cycle compared to the Trump convictions is diametrically opposite. You kind of feel sorry for President Biden, and you were wondering, what was Donald Trump thinking when he did all this stuff? So I actually think, I mean, I'm not willing to say it's going to benefit Biden. It's a distraction. The campaign wishes it never happened. They should have cut a deal when they had the chance. All of this would have never been taking place. That being said, I mean, the way I read the press is, you know, I don't want to say Biden's having a good press day, but it's the best press day he could have imagined out of a guilty verdict.
That's fascinating. Then again, we're not talking about Donald Trump's interview with his probation officer yesterday because we're talking about this. So is this liberal news media a genie or a fair shake?
It's hard to tell. I think we have to wait and see how this all shakes out. But I do think it's important to remember that in the 2020 debate, one of the best moments that Joe Biden had, to Rick's point, is when he talked about Hunter Biden. I love my son. We support him. That was one of the things. In addition to this, what was it, stand up, stand down, whatever that was with Donald Trump, that people remembered from the debate and empathized with him. So that is, something that, if you can say there's anything positive out of this for Joe Biden, it is that. I also think the campaign on the Biden side wants to continue to make the case that this is a family issue, the loving his son argument, which is absolutely true, but also the fact that he said in his statement released that he supports the justice process, he respects it, and he's not going to get involved in it. And that is a stark contrast to what we heard when Donald Trump was convicted. So I know while Rick is talking about how the media messages may differ, the reality is the response from at least Joe Biden and Donald Trump to the convictions differed. Donald Trump said he'd been set up, persecution, which spoke badly about the justice. You heard none of that from the president. What you heard was, I love my son and I respect the justice system and we're going to support him in his appeals and whatever happens. So that can also explain, if there are different messages in the media, where those are coming from.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll tell you, Hunter Biden's verdict is not going to help Jackie Rosen win or lose her seat. Not going to help Nancy Mace win or lose her seat. This is a primary day, and we would typically be looking at these races, which I'd like to ask you about. Against the backdrop of Hunter, I get it. We're going to hear from the special counsel likely in about 10 minutes here. But can we start in Nevada with Rick and Jeannie? This is important here, where the Democratic incumbent, Jackie Rosen, said to be one of the most vulnerable in the Democratic-controlled Senate right now. And we've got Sam Brown and Jeff Gunter in a Republican primary to find out who's going to run against Jackie Rosen. This is the race that Donald Trump took a stand in after his big rally in Nevada on Sunday, in which he basically didn't mention either of them. He put it out on Truth Social on Sunday night, siding with the establishment, going with the Army veteran Sam Brown, a favorite of the NRSC, instead of Jeff Gunter, the former Trump ambassador to Iceland, described as a MAGA-minded businessman. Rick, when you look at this Republican primary, who got to Donald Trump?
Well, I think that one of the things Donald Trump has done this cycle, which is different than 18 and 20 and 22, is he has actually sided with a lot of mainstream incumbents. And I think the days of being the disruptor within a Republican caucus in the House and Senate are over. The idea that the NRSC and Donald Trump would endorse the same person, would have been impossible only a few years ago. So Sam Brown looks to make his way through this. And by the way, I mean, like if you're Gunter, I mean, like what Trump administration official hasn't Trump screwed in the last 5 years? So, I mean, come on.
Wow.
You know, like you should have expected. You know, I pledged to support the president, and then he throws you under the bus. But this is, I think, the most important race happening today because I think Jackie Rosen is one of the most vulnerable Democratic incumbents in the country. She could be the 51st vote for Republicans. And Sam Brown comes out with a win here, which would be anticipated. That is one of the key matchups we'll be watching all the way through November.
Well, I'll tell you what, Jeff Gunter's ready to torch the place, Jeannie. He took to Twitter yesterday, writing, here's the gist of what happened. He showed up at that rally, by the way, apparently thinking he was going to get an endorsement. Scam is told by his handlers he's getting endorsed at the rally. Some awesome and fearless MAGA warriors make it clear this would be a terrible idea. Don't do it. DJT does not endorse at rally. NRSC McConnell Swamp freaks out. On plane ride back, big check comes in from the swamp. McConnell aligned pack? Truth Social post comes out late last night. Sadly, suspicions many of us had about endorsements are being confirmed. I guess his political career is over, Jeannie?
You know, it's so interesting. These people never seem to learn. I told you yesterday, my favorite is Bob Good traipsing down to the courthouse as if he was going to get, you know, his presence there. And then, of course, the next day, Trump endorses his opponent. And you see this with Gunter, to Rick's point, you know, who in that administration hasn't been let down is probably a kind word or kind way to say it by Donald Trump. But, you know, I do think that Trump's decision this time around to look the other way from some of these more MAGA right-wing people he could be endorsing and go in the other direction is really interesting because we've also seen people come out and publicly take him on that. And so I think you do start to see this little rift. It's small at this point, but you wonder if there's going to be mounting pressure on Donald Trump because of some of his more moderate or mainstream endorsements.
Well, Chris LaCivita responded to the Gunter meltdown, Rick. Wow. This is really something. He's mad, he writes, because he did not earn the endorsement of President Trump. He says in an interview, Gunther should be mindful about poking the bear one too many times, he said, because I will promise you, you will get your ass bit. What's in the future here for Jeff Gunter?
What's in the future for Jeff Gunter will be completely determinative on the end of today. If he wins the primary, everyone is kissing his butt, not biting it, because it is a seat that they really want to win. And Chris LaCivita will have to send out another text that will sort of put things right.
Wow.
And Donald Trump will be the first one that shows up in Nevada and talk about what a great guy he is. He pointed him to being an ambassador, and he always thought he was the best in the case. I mean, like, all of it would just get unwound, but it's not likely to happen.
It's so easy.
The entertainment value would be enormous.
Rick, South Carolina, Nancy Mace. This is the retribution tour for Kevin McCarthy. He's put up Catherine Templeton to run against Nancy Mace, the Republican incumbent. Does she have to worry? Does this go to a runoff?
Yeah, if it goes to the runoff, she has to worry. And of course, in South Carolina, you know, their rules are you got to get over 50% to avoid a runoff. And rarely multi-candidate fields produce that. So it's a trick. And I think this is the best one to watch because, one, Nancy Mace is hilarious. She was against Trump before she was for him. And so, you know, she is a transformative figure. And this is the revenge tour, one of 8 who voted against Kevin McCarthy for Speaker, threw him out, and he has vowed revenge. I mean, he's put money in from his House Majority PAC and is recruited Catherine Templeton and is campaigning there for her, as is Newt Gingrich and others. So it's not without its fireworks in South Carolina.
Yeah, Templeton endorsed by Newt Gingrich, as well as South Carolina Representative Joe Wilson. You lied. So this is going to be something to watch here. Rick Davis, Jeannie Shanzano are back in our second hour where we welcome our global television audience to the conversation. Kaylee will be here as well. as we reset the clock and what's happening here. 3 up and 3 down for Hunter Biden, guilty on 3 felony charges, as we stand by to hear now from the special counsel in this case. He's going to be speaking, as we mentioned, just about 5 minutes away at the top of our second hour here. He'll be holding forth from Wilmington, Delaware. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Stay with us on the fastest show in politics. We've got much more ahead on Bloomberg.
politics to the world of business. This is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
Joe Biden says he will respect the judicial process as Hunter Biden becomes the first child of a president to be convicted of crimes. Welcome to the fastest show in politics. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines in Washington. And Kaylee, guilty on 3 counts. We're going to be exploring both the political and legal implications this hour. A lot of questions, though, about what it might mean for the race.
Absolutely. Of course, Hunter Biden here found guilty of these 3 crimes in relation to his purchase of a handgun in 2018 when he was addicted to crack cocaine. The president today not just speaking of his respect for the judicial process, but also his support for his son. But obviously, this brings not just personal ramification to him, Joe, potentially political as well.
Yeah, we've got a couple of different ways to balance that. Of course, the campaign trail, a presidential election underway, but also an effort on Capitol Hill, particularly by the Republican House Conference, to try to impeach Joe Biden, to paint this picture of the Biden crime family. And for them, this is another brick in the wall.
Absolutely. And now it's worth noting we will be hearing in just moments from David Weiss, the special counsel from the Department of Justice that brought these charges against Hunter Biden. We will bring those to you when we get them. First, though, let's get a quick check on the markets. Charlie Pellet has that for us.
Thank you very much, Kaylee Lyons. Indeed, looking at a mixed market right now. We have got the Dow, the S&P. They are both trading lower. NASDAQ in the green. The NASDAQ Composite Index up by 0.1% higher right now by 20 points. The Dow down 277, drop there of 0.7%. S&P right now down 13, a decline of 0.3%. 10-year yield 4.45%, but the 2-year now yielding 4.86%. Spot gold lower a little change, down almost $2 the ounce right now, 23.09. Barrel of West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.7%, 78.28 a barrel. Bank stocks are sliding. Case in point, J.P. Morgan Chase lower now by 2.6%. Citigroup hard hit down 4%, and Wells Fargo down now by 1.3%. After the bell, Oracle recapping. S&P trading lower now by 15, a drop there of 0.3%. Balance of power continues now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
All right, Charlie Pellet up in New York, thank you so much. Meanwhile, all of our attention here in Washington has been in Wilmington, Delaware today, where we got the verdict from the jury, 12 peers finding Hunter Biden guilty of 3 different crimes. It's worth pointing out, Joe, that those 3 crimes combined could carry a maximum sentence of 25 years in prison. Although that sentencing has not happened yet, the judge did not set a date for that today.
Yeah, the fact that we don't have a sentencing date is interesting because obviously we're just trying to get a sense of what that could mean and whether there's going to be an appeal based on the statement from Avi Lowell. It looks like there will be one. It's just a question of what form that appeal takes. And we want to hear about it from Eric Larson, Bloomberg legal reporter, who has gone from one courthouse in Lower Manhattan covering Donald Trump's trial to one in Wilmington with Hunter Biden, and back with us from world headquarters in New York. Eric, it's great to see you here. The next phase would be sentencing. How long will we wait?
Well, the judge ended the hearing today without giving any indication other than to say that normally in most cases it would be about 120 days out. That's what the judge said. That would put his sentencing in October, which of course would be just about a month before the election. So it's unclear what the parties will argue. Hunter Biden could argue for later sentencing, suggesting that it could go after the election, or make some other arguments for a delay, or prosecutors could try to have it happen sooner just to get it out of the way.
Well, and how would that timeline and potentially the appeal process, if the defense does indeed pursue that, interact with the separate trial that he is facing in California in September on tax charges? Could failure to wrap up this case entirely be justification for a delay in that case potentially?
It's possible, but that could also go the other way. Prosecutors could argue to have a sentencing happen faster, to get it wrapped up before the next trial begins. It's kind of a similar argument in discussions that we've had around Trump with his 4 competing criminal cases. And of course, most of those did end up getting delayed, but we do have sentencing happening anyway in that first Trump case. So these will happen, eventually will happen. But this September trial is really going to be a huge threat to Biden, I think much more significant than this gun case. So they're going to have a lot of preparation getting ready for that one.
Eric, we're waiting to hear from the special counsel. David Weiss will be holding forth soon from Wilmington. Less than a year ago, he was on Capitol Hill in a closed-door hearing with lawmakers, professing to the level of authority that he had in this case to bring charges. Republicans were concerned that there was interference in this case. He made clear there was not. What's he going to say today?
I think he's going to make a very strong case for his independence. He's going to point out that he's going to say that he wasn't being told what to do in any way. Of course, Trump and his allies insist that Joe Biden has been pulling the strings behind the scenes here. The special counsel is going to insist on the independence. In fact, that's the whole point of a special counsel. That's why Merrick Garland appointed him, was to get rid of any suggestion of involvement by the White House.
Well, Eric, it'll be interesting to hear the special counsel speak to the nature of these charges as well that he was found guilty of, considering we've heard repeatedly that it's a bit abnormal for a case like this to be going into court. This question around lying on the forms when purchasing a gun we have heard usually wouldn't have been prosecuted in this way, a case pursued this heavily. Can you just provide some context here as to how unusual this is?
Well, I think arguments can be made on both sides there. Perhaps it's possible that individuals who are caught lying on a form like this may not be charged. But in a case as high profile as this, when you have a defendant who is being investigated so deeply, it's difficult for a prosecutor or an investigator to uncover significant wrongdoing and then just not charge it. I mean, that would have played into the allegation that Hunter Biden was receiving special treatment. Although we did see that there was this plea agreement that was reached. Of course, that all fell apart because largely, the judge questioned whether or not Hunter Biden should be free from any future prosecution. They basically saying that the deal was too sweet for Hunter Biden, and sort of played into the Republican criticisms there. So, clearly the jury agreed here. Whether or not every single case like this would have been brought, it was put before a jury, and they deliberated for just 3 hours before deciding that the government was correct and that Hunter Biden had broken this law.
Yeah, the whole thing did happen relatively quickly. Bloomberg legal reporter Eric Larson, thank you so much for joining us, helping us break things down. We want to get some more reaction now from Nicole Bernecki. She is a partner at Jodre Bernecki and is joining us now from New York. Nicole, welcome to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. We were just speaking with Eric there about the relatively unclear timeline as to when sentencing could actually happen. But do you expect that Hunter Biden will serve at least some time in prison for these crimes he was found guilty of?
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. I honestly do not expect that he will serve any time, and this has nothing to do with him being a public figure. Sentencing in federal courts is a process. It's a mechanical process that requires practically going down a checklist of many factors. You have to see if there's factors that are aggravating, factors that are mitigating. He potentially, right now he's accused of these tax crimes as well. That has not been resolved. So the issue of whether there will be any priors to consider is still open. But there's other factors as well, whether the crime was violent, whether there were any victims that had to be made whole. As we know, this is not really applicable here. So I don't think that this will result in incarceration, but we will obviously see what will happen depending on the outcome of the other case and how quickly this will go.
Nicole, as we wait to hear from the special counsel in this case, he's going to be speaking from the podium in Wilmington shortly here. I wonder your thoughts on the quick nature of these deliberations, only 3 hours, and what type of case Hunter Biden's attorneys will bring on appeal.
I think the reason that it went so fast with the deliberations is that if you think about it, this case actually is pretty simple on its face. That's why there was not a lot of witnesses, not a lot of evidence, because this case revolved around his intent and whether he committed these acts that he was accused of knowingly. So the jury can consider credibility issues, can consider circumstantial evidence to create a picture of whether this was knowing and intentional. And I think that in their minds, given his prior history of drug use and his own candor in discussing his drug use problems, I think they just didn't have a big dilemma right there in order to determine that he was actually guilty and committed it knowingly.
So what could the defense do on appeal realistically to change the narrative, to change minds, Nicole, or do you not really see a path for that?
I think it will be very complicated. First of all, the success of appeal depends on what objections they asserted on the record. There is certain procedure in bringing an appeal. You have to preserve it during the trial. So we would need to know, reading the transcript, how effective they were at doing that. But in terms of the legal theory and in terms of the jury's decision and in terms of the fact that there was not a lot of witnesses, not a lot of evidence, I don't think this will be an easy appeal for them to be successful on.
It's interesting to consider. We spoke earlier with Nick Ackerman, the former Watergate prosecutor. Nicole, he said it would behoove Hunter Biden and his legal team to plead guilty at the next trial, the tax evasion trial, to get preferred favorable treatment. Do you agree?
There is some merit to that. It really depends on the evidence in the other case, but I think it's also pretty straightforward. I don't think he has a lot of defense, so it would be better to just get it out there and be proactive about finalizing these cases instead of dragging them to trial. If the evidence is overwhelming and if your chances are slim to none at prevailing, so they have to have a honest discussion and see what's the best course of proceeding, but I think that a guilty plea would make a lot of sense.
Wow.
Well, Nicole, I also wonder about whether or not Hunter Biden, having made the decision not to testify in his own defense this time around, maybe should consider doing so in the appellate process. I mean, if all of this is about his state of mind and his intention when he bought that gun in 2018, can anyone else really describe that other than he himself?
You make a great point, but in the legal process, it's a little different. It's usually advisable not to put the defendant on the stand because that opens a lot of doors to questions that can just ruin their defense and ruin their case. And I think that in his particular case, given the books that he wrote, given the statements that he made, I think it's better that he just does not testify on his own behalf. That would be a better legal strategy. But as I said, these two cases are slightly different, so we'll see what they decide.
Thanks for being with us here on Bloomberg TV and radio as we anticipate commentary from David Weiss, the special counsel. Nicole, if we have to interrupt you, our apologies in advance. The podium has been set, and we understand that he's going to be speaking about 5 minutes from now. Nicole, what will he tell us about this case? What point does he need to make today as the political world as well as the legal world watches?
In case of this particular case, as well as the Trump case that ended in New York, as you stated, these are very popular defendants. These are public figures. So, but he needs to definitely emphasize the fact that we need to look at the evidence and the law, and not just not be influenced in any way by the fact that he's the son of a sitting president.
Well, a sitting president for now, Nicole, who has promised that he would not pardon Hunter Biden for these crimes, but he, of course, is competing for re-election right now. Say he loses in November and becomes a lame duck and decides maybe he has nothing else to fear politically and pardons Hunter Biden at that time. Could that be something then undone by Donald Trump if he wins a second term in office?
It could, but you're also making a great point. I know that right now he's saying that he will not pardon him, but he can change his decision later. We need to remember that he's also currently an actively campaigning politician, so he needs to say things that are right in the eyes of the public, especially right now. It's a very sensitive time given that the political polls state that they each have 50-50 chance of winning. So everything that they do going forward will have a lot of significance for the campaign. So he's saying that right now it makes a lot of sense, but we'll see what he does later.
Nicole Brunecki, partner at Jodrey Brunecki. We appreciate your insights. Nicole, thank you for being with us here on this breaking news day with a guilty verdict, 3 counts guilty for Hunter Biden. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington here on Bloomberg TV and radio. As mentioned, we're going to bring you remarks shortly from the special counsel David Weiss, who is in Wilmington, Delaware, where this trial was taking place. And Kaylee, it'll be interesting to hear how he frames this, knowing he's not going to be taking questions, apparently, from reporters today.
Yeah, just making a statement. We'll see how long that it is. We just got the 2-minute warning from him, and I believe we see a number of figures, including David Weiss, approaching the podium right now. And the tenor of this will be something to pay attention to. So let's take a listen to the special counsel.
Submitted to a federal firearms dealer about his addiction or use of crack cocaine, and possessing a firearm while a user or addict. There have been two overarching themes emphasized by the prosecution during trial: this defendant's illegal choices and the rule of law. First, while there has been much testimony about the defendant's abuse of drugs and alcohol, ultimately, this case was not just about addiction, a disease that haunts families across the United States, including Hunter Biden's family. This case was about the illegal choices defendant made while in the throes of addiction, his choice to lie on a government form when he bought a gun, and the choice to then possess that gun. It was these choices and the combination of guns and drugs that made his conduct dangerous. Second, no one in this country is above the law. Everyone must be accountable for their actions, even this defendant. However, Hunter Biden should be no more accountable than any other citizen convicted of this same conduct. The prosecution has been and will continue to be committed to this principle and to the principles of federal prosecution in carrying out its responsibilities. I want to thank the jury for their service. There are few civic responsibilities more important than jury service. 15 Delawareans came to court each day and performed their responsibilities in a professional and conscientious manner. We thank them. I want to thank Derek Hines, Leo Wise, and the entire special counsel team. I am so proud of this group of attorneys, agents, and litigation professionals. This is a difficult assignment. These folks have been working 7 days a week for the last couple months, litigating a variety of issues in district and appellate courts on two coasts. They have given their heart and soul to this work. They represent the best that public service has to offer. I am incredibly grateful. Finally, I want to thank Attorney General Garland for providing the support necessary to fulfill our mission, ensuring that we have the independence to appropriately pursue our investigations and prosecutions. As you know, we have additional trials and investigative work to be done, so I will not entertain questions at this time. Our work continues. Thank you for your consideration. Thanks.
We've heard from jurors asking, Mr. Weiss, would you entertain a plea deal in the California case? I'm a witness to Joe Biden being a criminal.
No time for questions, it seems. The special counsel, David Weiss, that's live for you there on Bloomberg TV and radio, live from Wilmington, Delaware, thanking the jury just a short time after we learned that the president's son, Hunter Biden, found guilty on all three felony counts, becoming the first child of a president of the United States to be found guilty of crimes. Interesting, no questions today, Kaylee, remembering it was just months ago that the special counsel was behind closed doors on Capitol Hill with being asked real questions about his authority and whether Joe Biden was interfering in this case, as Donald Trump has alleged, and his answer was consistently no, he was in control.
And he reiterated that to some extent in those remarks just now. He said he wants to thank Attorney General Garland for providing the support necessary to pursue their mission, assuring that we had the independence to pursue this prosecution. He definitely made sure to emphasize that at the end of his remarks, including his emphasis that no one in this country is above the law. He said Hunter Biden should be no more accountable than any other citizen of this same conduct.
We're going to bring in our panel, if that's, is the panel set to go here? Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano are with us, Bloomberg Politics contributors, for their take on this. It's great to have you both with us here. Jeannie, now that you've heard from the special counsel your feelings on this day Hunter Biden is found guilty, and I'm asking you this from a political perspective. I don't want to turn either of you into legal analysts here, but this is important. There seems to be an equivalency in many minds between this case and that of the former president, Donald Trump, who's running for re-election. Do you see it that way?
To a certain extent, I mean, we are hearing that. I will tell you what comes top of mind for me amidst all of this stunning news that we've had in the last couple of weeks, but certainly today, is really the fact that, you know, the Trump campaign is having sort of machinations going on behind the scenes as to how they're going to respond to this. And I think this is important to underscore. He's been empathetic in the last week to this issue of addiction. We just heard the special counsel say this case wasn't about addiction. It was about lying on a form. But there's also the underreported reality here that this is a Second Amendment case, a case that many Second Amendment supporters feel that Hunter Biden can and should take to the Supreme Court and potentially win. And of course, I'm not clear as to why the president's team has him lined up today to go talk about gun prevention. It's just sort of this conflation of odd realities here that are creating a mishmash, and the Trump campaign issues a statement, pulls it back. So it's hard for both of these campaigns to respond to this, given all that it entails. But I do want to underscore the 2A community, very, very supportive of Hunter Biden on this, nothing to do with his father, but to do with the issue of the Second Amendment and the fact they think that this could expand access to guns, something that would be ironic if Hunter Biden takes that to the Supreme Court, given the fact where his father is right now and always has been politically on guns.
Yeah, and he quite literally today is at an Everytown for Gun Safety event. The split screen is pretty remarkable. Jeannie was mentioning the reaction from the Trump campaign. Rick, we got in a statement, a quote, "This trial has been nothing more than a distraction from the real crimes of the Biden crime family." Of course, those crimes have not been fully borne out in a formal prosecution or a jury of peers finding them guilty of anything. That is just the case in this case where Hunter Biden was found guilty of these three crimes. How difficult is it for the Trump campaign to seize on this conviction? Is this actually potentially just difficult water to navigate, considering we are talking about addiction here, something that also has plagued Donald Trump's own family?
That's right. I'm glad you mentioned that, Kelly, because, you know, a lot of people don't realize that Donald Trump's brother, Fred Jr., died of alcohol addiction. And it's a issue that he doesn't talk openly about, but did, you know, after becoming president. And I think it was one of the most honest moments of the Trump presidency in 2017. So I'm sure that part of this informs, you know, that opinion of the Trump campaign and Donald Trump himself. That being said, if they thought this could be exploited to hurt Joe Biden, I think they would. And I think that's why they're being cautious, because I don't think they see an opening in the exploitation. I'm sure they've pulled it. I'm sure Tony Fabrizio is sitting in there saying, be careful, guys. Yeah, this is likely to blow back on you if you go after the sins of the son. And frankly, the Judiciary Committee under Jim Jordan has failed miserably at trying to connect the two and create a impeachment process for Joe Biden. So as you point out, nobody's been able to find the goods on the Biden crime family. And so I think this was a head nod in that direction, but I don't think it goes very far from here.
As we're talking politics here, Jeannie, and I know this stuff is very deeply personal for a lot of families, many of whom we're hearing from on social media, who can relate with the Bidens today. Is there an empathy vote? Is that part of this for the Biden campaign?
There could be. We haven't seen that show up in the polls yet. Of course, we're just an hour or two out of the conviction, so we may see that. But I'm reminded about the 2020 debate when one of the most important statements that Joe Biden made, the most remembered, if you will, after the debate, was the fact that he said, "I love my son," when it was brought up, and I support him, and he's struggling with addiction. That was something a lot of voters looked at him and said, we feel your pain, so to speak. We understand, because so many of us, including, as Rick just mentioned, the former president, have dealt with this issue. You know, one other thing we should keep in mind as we think of the politics, and you were just talking to Nicole about this prior to the special counsel statement, was on this issue of the pardon. The president said, "I will not pardon my son." What he hasn't said, as far as I know, and I'm curious for one of the great Bloomberg reporters to ask, does that include commuting a sentence? Because he can pardon, he can also commute. And depending on what happens with this, what happens in the sentencing phase in this and or the tax case, would he consider commuting that sentence? I don't think he would, and I don't think he should, but he hasn't, as far as I know, gone on the record of the difference between the pardon and the commutation. And he could constitutionally do both.
It's an excellent point, Jeannie. I wonder if that is a question he may end up being asked in a presidential debate in this cycle, keeping in mind that the first one is just 16 days away, scheduled for June 27th in Atlanta, Rick. And as we consider what the tenor of that debate may be like, how these various legal troubles plaguing both the Biden family through Hunter Biden and Donald Trump through his myriad legal cases that he is facing may come up, does this conviction today take away a talking point from Donald Trump about the weaponization of a justice system, considering that very same system just convicted the son of a president?
Yeah, he has to be careful. It's not an easy attack now, because the parry on this by Biden could be very powerful. Could be that, if there was any political manipulation at the Justice Department, wouldn't I have done it for my own son? That could be a big moment in the debate. And so I think Donald Trump has to be extraordinarily cautious, and even because he's got sentencing after that. And so the last thing you want to do is use a national debate to work the judge in this case, in a way that is going to have the judge basically say, look, obviously there's no remorse for Donald Trump. Let's put him in the Hooskow. Rikers Island is not a bad place to spend the weekend. So I think that it's a very treacherous issue for Donald Trump now. It was kind of a free option for the last year. He could say and do pretty much whatever he wanted to. Got a couple of fines for breaking gag orders, which were totally irrelevant. And now it's actually going to potentially hurt himself. And that's when I think you'll see Donald Trump's self-interest come to the fore and probably temper anything he says about these legal issues.
Jeannie, I want you to go a little bit further down the road you were just driving here. Whether it's a commutation or a pardon, if Joe Biden changes his mind, how does that play publicly here? If we're looking at what appears to be a benign reading on the campaign trail now, what would an action like that mean?
Very, very tough for Joe Biden, because of course he has publicly said he won't pardon. He would have to go back on his word, and that never sort of sits well with people, because it's considered a lie. Now, he could try to explain it away. This is my son, but that would play right into the hands of this two-tier justice system that the Republicans keep talking about. And of course, if we go further down the line, imagine if Donald Trump wins and Joe Biden is a lame duck. Does, legacy reasons he may care, but otherwise he may say, I am going to make a really tough sort of Sophie's choice, if you will, between my duties as a parent and my love for my son and my duties as the president of the United States. Now that I'm a lame duck, I'm going to think about seriously pardoning or commuting. There's no good option here. Again, I think most of us would empathize that this is a tough decision, but how he manages that, I think, is going to be fascinating to watch. And of course, we've got the tax trial coming up in LA, and people are going to be a lot less forgiving, I think, on that than they are on this gun issue. So that is going to complicate things further for the president.
Yeah, especially considering the timing with that scheduled for September, where we are much closer to the vote on November 5th. I also want to talk about how this reflects not just on Hunter Biden and the Biden family, but the Department of Justice. We heard Special Counsel David Weiss in his remarks just moments ago, specifically calling out Attorney General Merrick Garland, thanking him for providing them the resources and the independence to bring this prosecution forward. But Merrick Garland also, as soon as this week, could be held in contempt of Congress, at least on the floor of the House. That's something that they are pursuing, and has been last week before testifying before a chamber in the House, and in a Washington Post op-ed today defending the Justice Department. The op-ed published said, in recent weeks, we have seen an escalation of attacks that go far beyond public scrutiny, criticism, and legitimate and necessary oversight of our work. They are baseless, personal, and dangerous. Rick, how do you think Hunter Biden now being convicted may alter the way in which Congress pursues these questions around the Justice Department? Can you hold Merrick Garland in contempt over her audio tapes if he did just allow all of this to happen to an unpopular president's son?
Yeah, I think it's arguable that there's been open warfare between the House Judiciary Committee, Jim Jordan, and the Department of Justice since Jordan became chairman. And this is very unhealthy for our democracy and for the legal system. Jordan went all over he could late last year, bring Weiss, the special prosecutor, into a hearing in the Justice Committee. First time anybody can remember a special counsel actually testifying to Congress before there's any trial at all and any prosecution. So it broke a lot of ground, new ground, and not positive ground. I mean, that was the beginning of a very bad cycle. And it now, as you say, has presented itself here. I think this verdict completely undermines Jim Jordan's entire premise, which is the Department of Justice is cooking the books for Hunter Biden and in reverse going after actively prosecuting Donald Trump. So right now, I think it makes Jordan look bad. I think it undermines the ability to go after a subpoena. I think there'll be Republicans who say, why are we talking about this? This is not something that we want to go into the election year to discuss. This is fundamentally the problem with the right wing of the Republican Party. They want to go down swinging, even if that means losing. And the vast majority of Republicans in the House want to be in the majority next year and continue to make policy changes they think are important. So this is as much a conflict within the Republican caucus as it is in between the Department of Justice and Jim Jordan.
Isn't that type of overreach, Jeannie, the best thing that could happen to the Biden campaign?
It is. It's one of the best things that could happen to them. But I'm listening to Rick and I'm agreeing with him personally, but then I'm thinking back to what Jim Comer said when the conviction came out, and he's the chair of the Oversight and Accountability Committee. And what did he say? You hear them saying that the DOJ tried to give Biden a sweetheart plea deal that was smoked out by a federal judge. Today is a step forward in accountability, he says. But until the DOJ investigates everyone involved in the corrupt, family, I can't remember the exact words, Biden family, that generated like almost $20 million, according to his account, then the DOJ is going to continue to be in the pocket, so to speak, for the big guy, Joe Biden. Now, some of that is by memory, so I didn't get his exact words right, but you could hear the tone, which is that this is not going to put this to rest, at least according to Jim Comer and that committee, apparently. And they are saying this only happened because the federal judge, smoked out the sweetheart deal and made Hunter Biden go on trial. So this is where we stand. And I think they're going to continue running down this road as fast as they can. They can't get Joe Biden yet for an impeachment, but they're darn sure going to keep going after Hunter and the rest of the family.
Yeah, it's great to point out this statement from Chairman Comer. Certainly, we've seen a lot of statements flying thick and fast today, including the statement that we got from the president. But Jeannie, do we also need to actually hear from him on this, not in written form? Should he say something to address cameras, address the media? We just got an update and guidance from the White House. He's going to go to Wilmington this afternoon after his remarks here in Washington at that Everytown event. He'll be in Wilmington, Delaware, presumably going to the side of his son. Does he need to say much more?
I think he should. I am not surprised he is going to be with Hunter on this very tough day for his son, but I think he should say exactly what their statement said in his own words. I love my son. Jill and I support him. We're proud of him for his recovery. We also respect the justice system and the jury verdict, and we will support him as he continues to look forward to appeals. And I am going to go, spend some time with my family in private. I think all of us as human beings could respect a statement like that, and I think he should say it. I don't know if he will. I think if he does, it'll probably be like with helicopters spinning around, so it's hard to hear him, but I think he should try to say it and get that word out.
All right, Jeannie Sheehan Zaino and Rick Davis, Bloomberg Politics contributors, thank you so much for joining us on what is another historic day in American political history. The first time ever that a child of a sitting president has been convicted of crimes, Joe. And of course, this is less than 2 weeks after the former president was also convicted of a number of crimes. Just a remarkable moment that we are in.
That's for sure. You're going to hear a lot of talk about equivalency and a lot of folks who wonder why we're talking about this so much. And we're hearing from all of them on the terminal and on social media. But we're trying to do the news as it happens here, as we always promise, from an unbiased point of view here on Bloomberg. To that end, we should get up to date on world and national headlines.
Yeah, speaking of, Nancy Lyons has that for us in our 99.1 newsroom here in Washington. Hey, Nancy.
Thanks, Kaylee. Special counsel David Weiss says no one in this country is above the law. He made that statement after Hunter Biden was found guilty on all counts in his federal firearms trial. The president's son was charged for illegally buying and possessing a gun while being addicted to drugs. This happened in 2018. This is the first time the child of the sitting president has stood trial. President Biden says he will respect the judicial process as his son considers an appeal. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, before departing Tel Aviv on his latest diplomatic trip to try to end the war between Israel and Hamas, spoke with the families of the 8 remaining American hostages in Gaza. He says the only way to get all the hostages back to their loved ones is for both sides to commit to a ceasefire.
The proposal that President Biden put forward is the best way to do that.
Blinken says Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has reaffirmed his commitment to the proposed ceasefire proposal. Emmanuel Macron says his position as French president will not be affected by the result of legislative elections. Despite reports that he is considering quitting the job, Macron pushed back until tomorrow a speech that he had prepared to give today on his campaign agenda. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg.
9:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long at Bloomberg. A slide in bank shares, dragging stocks down ahead of the Fed decision tomorrow. 2 o'clock Wall Street time on Bloomberg Radio and Television. Complete coverage. And, of course, Fed Chair Jay Powell's news conference, 2:30 p.m. Wall Street time. Right now, we're looking at a mixed market. We've got the Dow, the S&P in the red. NASDAQ is advancing. We've got the S&P down 7 now. A decline of 0.1%. The Dow down 237, down 0.6. NASDAQ up 56, a gain of 0.3%. Apple shares today, they are trading at a record. Apple now surging by 6.2%. 10-year yield 4.42% with a 2-year yielding 4.84%. Spot gold up $1 the ounce to $23.11. Little change there. West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.5%. $78.11 for a barrel of WTI. Michael Dell, the CEO of Dell Technologies, intends to sell 10 million shares worth $1.3 billion. Dell shares, they are trading a little change right now. We do have Dell up by less than 0.1%. And just in time for the summer political conventions, United says it will be adding nearly 200 flights to the Republican convention next month in Milwaukee, 118 flights to and from Chicago for the Democratic National Convention in August. Shares of UAL, parent of United, down now by 2%. Recapping, S&P down 9, down 0.2%. Balance of power continues now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts. Here they are, Joe Matthew, Kaylee Lyons.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you. We're going to need those flights as we prepare to bring you live coverage from both the DNC and RNC, July and August. We have a lot to experience between now and then. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Has been spending a lot of time on the Hunter Biden verdict, as we promised you that we would. But Kaylee, we also have to turn our attention to this very slowly developing story in Israel. Antony Blinken on his 8th trip now to the Middle East, and of course a wait on what's going to happen with a potential ceasefire that the Biden White House rolled out some time ago now. The UN Security Council voting to endorse the ceasefire deal on the table yesterday, and now reporting that Hamas says that it is accepting that UN Security Council ceasefire resolution. Antony Blinken met with Benjamin Netanyahu to talk about this. Here's what he had to say.
I met with Prime Minister Netanyahu last night, and he reaffirmed his commitment to the proposal. Everyone's vote is in, except for one vote, and that's Hamas. And that's what we wait for.
For more, we turn now to Hadar Susskind. He is Americans for Peace Now president and CEO. As we make sense of what we're hearing from the Secretary of State, from the Israeli Prime Minister, and from Hamas itself, Hadar, it does feel like the messages are running potentially into some conflict here. As Blinken says, yes, Israel is behind this. Netanyahu has reaffirmed this, but Netanyahu and his government also reaffirmed that they want to see Hamas entirely destroyed, and a ceasefire agreement would potentially make that difficult to accomplish. And for Hamas saying that it does support the UN ceasefire resolution, we haven't seen all of the parties come out and say the ceasefire begins. So what is your understanding of what exactly is happening here?
Well, Kaylee, I think what we're seeing is both the Netanyahu government and the Hamas leadership want to be seen by the U.S., by the UN, globally, as saying yes to this. They want to be seen as the party that is moving toward peace. At the same time, while Netanyahu just reaffirmed it and Hamas has now welcomed the UN resolution, neither one has said, okay, let's sit down. Let's start talking. Let's implement the ceasefire. They both agreed in principle and said, all right, now let's start talking about the details, while at the same time, both telling their domestic audiences nothing has changed. On the Israeli side, Netanyahu and others in his government are still saying they're going to completely destroy Hamas. The war is not over until, again, Hamas is completely eliminated, and other very non-specific goals like that are frankly pretty impossible to measure. And Hamas, quite similarly, has accepted the principle, but is still launching attacks. Obviously, has not released hostages, and is still telling its constituency that its plans haven't changed either.
So bring us to a finer point here, Hadar. We all saw the president roll out a fairly detailed 3-phased plan that seemed to be something everybody had their eyes on here. But your point is a good one. Once all the parties sit down, they have to hammer out the fine print. What will be the sticking points when that happens?
Well, there's really one big one, right? The president's plan that he proposed, which again was presented as an Israeli proposal, not the president's proposal himself, said a 6-week ceasefire during which certain hostages would be released and negotiations would start for a long-term ceasefire, for a cessation of hostilities, actually, not just a ceasefire. And the president said, if after those 6 weeks, everything has not been finalized yet, but negotiations are ongoing, then that the ceasefire would hold. And the real difference, the break point here, is this insistence by Netanyahu that they will not end the war until Hamas is completely eliminated. And Hamas's, of course, insistence that they are not going to disappear. So that's the difference. The 6 weeks can be worked out, even the hostage release and the prisoner exchange, because part of this is, of course, Palestinian prisoners who are held in Israeli prisons being released. All of that could be worked out if the two sides would be willing to sit down and do so. But the whole plan here is to get to an actual end game. It's not just to have this short term and this, prisoner hostage exchange. And that's where the seemingly unbridgeable difference is.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seemed it was unbridgeable even inside the Israeli government because it was a disagreement over what exactly the end game should be that drove Benny Gantz out of the government, out of the war cabinet. He was unhappy with the prime minister not meeting his demands. What influence do you think that departure ultimately has on how this moves forward, Hadar?
Well, Gantz and his folks leaving still leaves Netanyahu with a 64-seat majority in the 120-seat Knesset. So it doesn't change anything immediately in terms of going to new elections. But it's one more sort of push, one more data point, because ultimately what we're going to need is to get to this agreement is a call for new elections and a new government. There is no way that this government, with not only Netanyahu, but the parties led by Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, those two in particular, will absolutely never agree to any kind of agreement. They've been quite clear on that. Now, the opposition parties led by Yair Lapid, Yair Golan, and others have said that should Netanyahu move forward with this agreement, they would support his government from the outside, not as members, to implement the agreement. But that would mean that sort of starts the clock ticking on the process of moving toward new elections. And the thing that is maybe the most interesting thing that came up this week is there's a lot of talk now that Netanyahu himself may be getting to the point where he realized he's played out this line. This government, he's dragged it out in all these different ways. He's done all these different things, and he may be ready to start organizing for new elections sooner rather than later.
Fascinating. How about the war cabinet, so-called, Hadar? Is Benny Gantz replaced by a hardliner, or does the war cabinet begin to fracture?
Well, the only people left in the government are very hardliners. And, Ben-Gvir, who has not had a seat in that war cabinet, has been demanding one. It's one of the things he wants to see happen. Frankly, I don't think it makes a very big difference whether he has that seat or not, because there are now no contrasting voices within the government. So the war cabinet becomes largely irrelevant, frankly, because you did have Gantz and his deputy Eisenkot sitting there with presumably at least some differing views, some moderating views. Now that they're out, the only voices in the government are very hardline. You also really have only one leader in the government with significant military experience, which is Yoav Gallant, the Secretary of Defense. Because again, Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, the religious party leaders, none of those people even served their regular, 3 years of military service, much less were they generals and military leaders. So they've really thinned the bench there within the coalition.
Hadar, do you think repeated visits like what we're seeing from the Secretary of State, are actually helpful in all of this? He has been to the Middle East now 8 times since October 7th, and it seems pretty consistently he leaves empty-handed, even though he says things like Netanyahu, when he spoke with him, still reaffirmed his commitments to a ceasefire agreement. Is the U.S. government helping?
Well, they're certainly trying to help, and I think that there are benefits to these visits. Remember, they're not solely for the purpose of meeting with Netanyahu or Israeli leaders. I met with Palestinian leaders, Jordanians, many others as well, and it's part of patching together the necessary coalition to have the political backing to move this forward. Look, I think the U.S. government can and should do more and can and should take a stronger position vis-a-vis the Israeli government. But what's sure is that this is not moving forward without that significant push from the Americans. And so having Secretary Blinken there, President Biden has been himself, so many of our other leaders, Burns, Jake Sherman, and others have been there, I think is important in trying to move these conversations forward. The question is, what's going to be the ultimate push, the ultimate declaration that nudges Netanyahu across the line? Because we can talk and talk and talk, and what we've seen now is many months of talking about ceasefires, talking about process, talking about different opportunities and different deals, but at the end, there's a binary decision, right? Yes or no. Is there a ceasefire? And whatever it is, we haven't gotten to that point yet. And I think the next big question or the next big moment out there is, of course, we have Netanyahu scheduled to come here to Washington on July 24th now. And we'll see what the situation is, on that day.
We're going to be calling you for insights, I think. Kedar Susskind, it's great to have you back, Kedar. Americans for Peace Now, President and CEO. A story that we'll keep tabs on here on Bloomberg TV and radio. It's worth mentioning, Kaylee, because we spent so much time, and you actually made tracks to Baltimore when it happened. The Francis Scott Key Bridge collapse, the deadly collapse, and a major milestone in the cleanup here as Baltimore's main shipping channel finally reopens.
Yeah, reopened yesterday, which is pretty remarkable. And it's actually something we had the chance to speak to Maryland Governor Wes Moore about a few weeks ago on May 30th, including the economic ramifications the collapse had for the state of Maryland and when he can confidently say things would get back to normal.
We saw during the month of April where there was a real concern about where unemployment rate for the state of Maryland was going to go for the month of April. And we're proud that because we were able to work with the private sector, work with our partners and all of our port partners, that not only for the month of April has Maryland continued to have amongst the lowest unemployment rates in the entire country, we actually gained thousands of jobs during that same time period and watched labor participation actually increase during the month of April. So I could not be more proud of the response of this state. We've got a long road to go, and I will not stop until we have a new bridge, a new Francis Scott Key Bridge built and overlooking the skyline of Baltimore. But the speed of this recovery really has been a marvel, and it's really been because we've had a coordinated effort in getting it done.
Well, you do have a lot to be proud of, Governor, and the heroic actions of the public safety officials in Baltimore and the state of Maryland, including the divers who have been risking their lives to comb the bottom of the floor of the port. Remarkable stories to tell. But then it becomes a question about money, and we've talked about this before on Bloomberg. In fact, we had a conversation earlier with Republican Congressman Patrick McHenry, chairs the House Financial Services Committee, and we asked him directly about the chances for a supplemental budget to rebuild the bridge passing this Congress. And he talked about offsets that would be needed, other budget cuts, suggesting that we're spending too much. What are you hearing from leaders in the House about that, making that happen to rebuild the bridge?
I've been incredibly encouraged by the amount of bipartisan support that we've received. People from not just the Democratic side of the House, but also people from Chair Womack and Chair Cole from Oklahoma and from Arkansas and Oklahoma, respectively. People who have said, we understand the importance of getting this bridge rebuilt because it's a core artery for the Port of Baltimore, which is indispensable to the American economy. And what we're asking for, the 100% cost share, is not saying, oh, the American people are going to pay for it. I'm very confident that the American people will be made whole. When you look at everything from insurance to potential pending litigation, Lloyd's of London has indicated this is going to be the most expensive maritime tragedy in our nation's history. So the American people will be made whole. The reason our ask for the 100% cost share is essentially bridge financing. It's saying that while we're going through the process of a potential litigation, which we know could take years, we've got to get moving. We've got to get building, because my commitment to the people of my state and the people of this country, frankly, is that we are going to build this thing on time and on budget and effectively, and we're going to get the Port of Baltimore going again because it's important to the larger supply chain of our nation. But we've got to get moving. That's the importance of the bipartisan support for the 100% cost share, and we've been incredibly heartened by the amount of by the encouraging words and supports that we've received from members from both sides of the aisle on this issue.
Maryland Governor Wes Moore talking with us last month about today's development now. This week, at least, the Port of Baltimore's main shipping channel fully reopened. I'm Joe Matthew. Kaylee Lyons, I'll meet you at 5 o'clock on the late edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
And a very good afternoon, everybody, live on radio, TV, YouTube, and Bloomberg Originals. I'm Carol Masser along with Tim Stenevec. And let's get to the setup at this hour on this FOMC Eve. I mean, Fed officials already meeting, but we won't get the decision until tomorrow. It will be the fourth policy decision by the Fed, Tim, so far here in 2024.
Okay, ahead of that decision, which we'll get tomorrow, and of course an updated dot plot, bank stocks are sliding. That's weighing on the overall trade. We're going to have more on the trade in just a moment. And speaking of the trade,
Speaking of the trade not sliding, everybody, check out shares of Apple actually hitting a record in today's session as investors who weren't impressed yesterday all of a sudden kind of seem kind of impressed. It's interesting. Apple Intelligence, all of a sudden, they're finding it interesting. We're going to dig into the details and why the flip when it comes to kind of the enthusiasm.
plus we've got the intelligence on the guilty verdict against Hunter Biden and the political ramifications of it for his dad, of course, President Joe Biden.
Yeah, we're going to get into all of that, break it down. And oh, yes, as Tim mentioned, we've got a Fed meeting coming. We've also got an inflation print before that Fed meeting tomorrow. It all happens on that Fed Wednesday. So we've got a lot coming your way in the next 60 minutes.
All right, before we get that going, first up, let's get a check of the day's trade and top business stories. Here's Charlie Pellet.
Thank you very much indeed. Lots of moving parts, and we've got you covered. Right now, U.S. stocks are trading mixed. The Dow, the S&P, they are both lower. S&P down 3, down less than 0.1%. As Carol mentioned, banks are sliding. Right now, the Dow is down 206, drop there of 0.5%. NASDAQ higher by 71 points, up by about 0.4%. 10-year, 4.40%, with a 2-year yielding 4.83%. Spot gold, now little changed, up less than 0.1%. 23.12 the ounce, while West Texas Intermediate crude is up 0.4%, 78.01 a barrel. Among some of those bank names that are declining today, J.P. Morgan Chase down 2.6%. Citigroup off session lows, but still down 3.5%. Wells Fargo down 0.9%. And after the bell, add this to the mix. Hear from a major tech company. Oracle will report fiscal fourth quarter results after the close of trading. Oracle shares ahead of earnings. Right now, they are unchanged. Again, recapping, stocks are mixed. S&P right now down 2.5 points. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, so appreciate it, Charlie. That is our setup on this Tuesday. As we've talked about, though, bond traders who have come to terms with the prospect of higher for longer interest rates through this year are looking toward tomorrow's Fed meeting for really clues on how to game it out 2025 and beyond. That's kind of where we're looking at this point. To be fair, though, we have to get through tomorrow's FOMC meeting and the dot plot, and before that, another inflation print at that 8:30 a.m. Wall Street time. So we'll all be focusing on that before we get to the decision.
Honestly, it sounds like the best day ever for us here at Bloomberg News.
You're just saying that because
it's like, what's great?
It
you got the Fed, you got CPI. What more in life is there to ask for, Carol?
It'll create a new narrative, no doubt about it, or potentially just reinforce the existing one. Let's get to it with Bloomberg News economics Molly Smith. She's here in studio, along with Bloomberg News economics reporter Steve Matthews. He's out there in our Atlanta bureau. Molly, I want to start with you. First up, 8:30 a.m. tomorrow, CPI report. What's expected? How might that shape thinking by the Fed and traders and economists about the U.S. inflation print?
Yeah, it's going to be a real Super Bowl of a day for everybody here on both sides of the building. So it's going to be really busy. So yeah, starting off with CPI at 8:30 in the morning. I mean, I think you're probably going to call this maybe moving sideways at best is still probably the story of inflation, or gradually, modestly slowing. So it's really, this is still nowhere near the disinflation that we saw at the end of last year that really was starting to fuel the rate cut narrative. And now it's really just more like treading kind of laterally and not so much those bigger, step downs that we had seen toward the end of the year. But, gas prices came down in the month, so that'll be helpful. It really just depends, though, how much broader beyond that the story is, because that's something that Fed officials have been looking for, that it's not just coming from energy and from goods categories. We need to see services moderate as well.
That's a good point. We are a service-led economy. Let's remind everybody.
Right. Housing especially.
Having said that, a higher print, a lower print, will it just be kind of, disregarded? Because what we keep talking about is we need to see like at least 3 reports to show an existent, kind of a really strong trend here when it comes to inflation.
Right. Yeah. And that's exactly the thing. When you had the prints in January through March that all came in above forecast, that really
was a trend.
Yeah, that really reset the clock then on, all right, we're back to 0. We need to now see another 3 prints to establish a trend. And we did get a little bit of that with the April print, that underlying inflation there, that's the core measure that excludes food and energy. That stepped down month over month for the first time in 6 months. That was a huge deal. If that can be repeated, also a huge deal.
Okay.
So, but
if If it can be repeated.
That would be important.
Certainly important to keep in mind. Hey, Steve Matthews, come on in here and sort of give us an idea of how tomorrow's CPI report or Friday's strong jobs report and the overall flow of economic data is going to be taken into account when we do get that policy decision and perhaps, I think more importantly for a lot of our viewers and listeners, the updated summary of economic projections.
You know, these meetings of the Fed have been kind of boring the last several
Hey,
meetings.
can't say that.
Sorry, Jay.
Sorry.
Hey, if Steve says it, it's
hey,
true.
Steve, you can say whatever you want.
You can.
But this is going to be a cliffhanger. This is going to have some fireworks because, you know, the economists that we survey are evenly split on whether the Fed's dot plot is going to show 2 rate cuts for this year or 1 cut. I mean, in March, they had 3 cuts that were priced in. We had bad inflation numbers in the first 3 months, as Molly said. April showed an improvement. And what we get tomorrow in the CPI could well set the tone for what happens with the dots. If we get a good number, you could perhaps stay at 2 cuts for the year. If you have 2 cuts for the year, that implies that the first cut could happen in September, arguably before that. So if you get 1 cut priced in the dots, that would suggest you're not going to get anything until after the election. So it's all important. And Jay Powell was asked about this at a recent press conference about, okay, if you get data in the middle of the meeting, do you really change the dots?
Right.
And his answer was, yes, we do change the dots. We encourage the FOMC members to change their dots in the middle of the meeting based on the latest data up until mid-morning of the second meeting. So they can change their dots tomorrow.
Well, wait a minute. And Tim's just like saying to me, wait, even if it's CPI?
Yeah, I mean, we're not talking about we're not talking about PCE here. We're not talking about the Fed's preferred inflation measures.
There are inflation
Steve,
prints,
come on.
and then there are inflation prints.
That's true. It's not the PCE, which is what they target, but it gives a good indication when you combine the CPI and the PPI together of what PCE is going to end up at.
It's really fun because I think the 3 of us were all thinking the same thing, like, okay, wait, does the Fed pull out like a giant whiteboard and say, okay, guys, we have to erase this because the CPI came in differently? You are saying, bottom line, yeah, if it's something very dramatic, they're going to rethink.
If it is away from consensus, if it is better than expected or worse than expected, they can definitely change their dots and they can change the way the median turns out.
Okay. I guess that's really interesting to hear because I actually thought, Molly, that they wouldn't take into account data that came day of. But look, if it is an upside surprise or a downside surprise, like Steve said, that could be part of the equation tomorrow.
Yeah, it really speaks to that whole cliffhanger element that Steve was telling us about here. So we're going to be on the edge of our seats in the morning. I'm sure, God only knows what's going to be happening in Washington at that time. And of course, they're going to be looking for that, core services ex-housing number. That's always a big one that they like to look at. So this is like the underlying services inflation in the economy that, taking out housing inflation because that has been so sticky, to just get a sense of what are the kinds of services, like travel, entertainment, other things that Americans are spending on. Where is that momentum heading? So that's going to be another one that they're going to be looking at very closely.
Steve Matthews.
Molly has that exactly right. The Fed is very focused on services, and Jay Powell is very focused on what's happening with services, and that's affected by what's happening with the labor market. So, to the extent that you've seen some kind of moderation in the labor market with unemployment ticking up just a little bit, then if you see that in the services inflation, that would be really encouraging to the Fed.
Well, here's the thing, Steve, because I know that we talk about this all the time in our group, but, I find it hard when we're covering the jobs report and we've got the payrolls survey, with the survey of businesses, the establishment survey, saying one thing with the payrolls number that was so strong last week, and then the household survey painting a very different picture of the labor market. So in your expert opinion, because you are the expert here, what would you say is the Fed's better signal right now of the truer signal of the labor market?
Well, I think that is going to be a really key question for Chair Powell in the press conference, is how does he view the labor market? Because it's like if you look at the job openings figures and the quit rate, the number of people quitting and the job openings per unemployed, all those seem to have returned to pre-COVID levels. So there are definitely some signs of moderation, but it will be really key to see how he sees the labor market, because if he sees the labor market as basically back to balance, then that says that they would be much more open to cutting rates.
All right, guys, sit tight. We've got another great voice we want to bring into this conversation. Back with us is Steve Skanke, Chief Economic Advisor at the wealth management firm Keel Point, former U.S. Treasury and White House National Security Council staff member. Steve Skanke joining us from Washington, D.C. Steve, good to have you here and join our conversation. You know, curious about what you've been hearing from Molly and from Steve Matthews and what your expectations are about what we get from the Fed tomorrow. It's as I agree with Steve Matthews, a little bit of a cliffhanger. Maybe it's the dot plot. You know, we're just kind of trying to figure out what the Fed is thinking, especially when you have a lot of folks saying, wait, it's not about a rate move this year. Think about 2025 and beyond.
Well, that's right, Carol, and thanks for having me on. I agree. It is a cliffhanger, and there's a lot of ways that it could go. I think, though, we start with the premise that Jay Powell would actually like to send a dovish tone. And the only inhibition to that would be as if we have a bad surprise on the CPI. But absent that, even though they're not going to cut rates, they're going to have a new dot plot. I think there's a growing concern that the economic data are moving toward an inconvenient slowdown in the economy. The jobs number was a surprise, but as you or Steve pointed out, I think, Carol, you pointed out, the household number was 400,000 jobs down, an increase in the unemployment rate, and to reconcile that with 272 after they revised down April to 165, a lot of opportunity to be confused in that. But as you look at first quarter GDP revised down, the second quarter GDP estimates among economists are now being revised down below 2%, and that spells concern for Jay Powell and the Fed.
So Steve Skanke, how are you thinking about this at Keel Point in terms of how many rate cuts you think the Fed will actually be able to do this year or should do this year? And it gets a little complicated with the whole election coming up in November.
It does. We still believe there's an opportunity for 2 rate cuts. Now, obviously, that could change very quickly if we have higher inflation prints, certainly from the CPI, which is not the Fed's preferred measure, but that then ultimately works itself into the PCE, personal consumption expenditures deflator. I think that they'd like to cut twice.
Yeah.
And so how do they do that? And if they can't cut twice, how does Jay Powell signal to the market that they're trying to go easier in their policy moves? You know, if CPI goes the wrong way, we very easily could see a dot plot that shows rate increases,
right?
Which would certainly disrupt financial markets.
That would be definitely a cliffhanger turning into falling off a cliff, perhaps. But come on back in, Molly.
Right about that.
Yeah.
I want to come back to Steve Matthews here. This is something that we talk about before every Fed meeting, and you know, Steve, sometimes it's you who's in the chair in DC who's asking Jay the questions. We talked about one that Powell will probably get is, how are you viewing the labor market right now? What's another one you'd really want to hear Powell answer?
I think, as Steve said, a big question is, how does he see the current economy? I mean, if you look at, for example, the Bloomberg Economic Surprise Index, the economic surprises have turned negative. I mean, we're now seeing data that is trailing the consensus estimates fairly consistently. And, you know, does that raise some concern that maybe the economy is moving to a below trend state?
Right.
And how much worried is he about that? I mean, obviously he's going to be asked about the dot plot and inflation, but it's like just the view of the total economy would be really important.
One point I wanted to bring up, it was really interesting on Surveillance this morning with a guest about how keeping rates more normal, remember, what we are in right now is more normal, actually gives the Fed a lot more room to cut rates if and when that is necessary. And that's a good good thing. Steve Matthews, you understand how the Fed moves and how it all works, right? The Fed having breathing room around policy is a really good thing.
Yeah, if you hear Powell or other Fed officials in the aftermath of this meeting talk about the Taylor rule and about monetary policy benchmarks, that is dovish, because right now the Fed's rates are much higher than what monetary policy rules would suggest they should be, which is around 4%. So there is room to bring rates down just based on inflation right now, if they become convinced that the economy can handle that.
So Steve Skanke, then, is the conversation of potentially a rate hike, is that just completely inappropriate then, based on what Steve Matthews is telling us?
Yeah, I believe that it's inappropriate, and I think Jay Powell probably has some concern about that. If we should see a negative surprise on CPI, the Fed uses forward guidance to constrain economic activity. I think the concern is that they need to encourage economic activity for the reasons that we've talked about. And so I would believe that there's a good chance, absent a CPI surprise, that the forward guidance is going to be toward easing, even though they won't change interest rates for probably the next couple of meetings.
Hey, Steve Skanke, very, very briefly, because we want to do a final round, but just in 30 seconds, what's at stake here if you don't see the Fed cutting rates this year? If that doesn't happen, how would you change how you advise the folks at Keel Point?
Well, the economy is fundamentally okay, but the downward revision that we've had in GDP growth and some of the mixed signals in the labor market certainly generate concern. Now, earnings growth continues to be remarkably positive, and so on that front, we're certainly positive. But we're very cautious if the Fed continues to hold tight and doesn't signal a willingness or desire to loosen. We think that'll work poorly for the economy and ultimately financial markets.
All right, our rapid round as we get ready to wrap up, and I'm going to start with you, Steve Skanke, very quickly. What would be a surprise coming from the Fed tomorrow? And you do need to be quick.
Well, for CPI to bump up and the dot plot to show a heavier orientation toward raising rates.
Wow, that would be crazy. Steve Matthews, real quick.
I'd say the dot plot showing just 0 or 1 cut, and also for long-term rates in the dot plot to move up in the neutral, so-called neutral rate.
That would be our new narrative. Molly Smith, saving the last 30 for you.
Maybe if Powell were to say that the labor market is still very tight, I think that would be it would be questionable of how he would fully support that. I think there are a lot of other data points that would maybe suggest otherwise.
Which is interesting, right, considering the mixed signals in the labor market if he comes out and says that they're tighter. You guys, the trifecta. Molly Smith, economics editor at Bloomberg News, right here in studio. Steve Matthews out there in our Atlanta bureau. He is our economics reporter, follows the Fed for us. And Steve Skanke, a regular guest here on Bloomberg Business Week, chief economic advisor at Keel Point, former U.S. Treasury and White House National Security Council staff member. On to the Fed decision we go. Thank you all so much. Still to come, Apple impresses finally on AI. That stock rallying. That's coming up next.
2:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got stocks trading at the high of the day as measured by the S&P 500 index, up 5 right now, higher by 0.1%. We've also got Apple very close to session highs. Look at Apple today, dramatic turnaround from yesterday. Apple up now by about 6.2%. Yes, more on the Apple story coming up in just a moment. A slide in banks dragging down stocks ahead of the Fed decision tomorrow. S&P, as I mentioned, trading at a record 53.66. Any move higher today will be another record, up 0.1%. NASDAQ also surging today, up 100 points. That is a gain for NASDAQ at a record, up 0.6%. The Dow, dramatically different story. The Dow down 150 now, down 0.4%. 10-year, 4.40%. The 2-year, 4.83%. Spot gold up $3 the ounce to $23.14, up 0.2%. While West Texas Intermediate crude oil higher now by 0.4%, 78.06 a barrel. Apple shares hitting their first intraday record since December today as investor sentiment around the iPhone maker continues to improve. Again, worth repeating, Apple right now up 6.2%. Recapping, stocks are mixed, but the S&P pushes higher, up 4, a gain of 0.1%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, it's not a fruit, but it is a very well-known company, Tim Stenovec. We do want to talk a little bit about Apple. It's your #1 gainer in the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ 100. What's interesting, Apple investors not impressed yesterday. And we also saw shares of some key Apple suppliers sinking overnight as well following their big event that got underway yesterday. But as we said, very different tone. Apple shares at a record after that great AI reveal. We want to get to it, though, once again, and lucky for us to have back with us our own Bloomberg News Chief Technology Correspondent, Mark Gurman, who continues to write about everything that we are getting from the event on Apple and just Apple in general. Mark out there in LA. So, Mark, what happened? Apple shares traded lower yesterday. We talked to you, rallying big time today. When we talked, kind of following the keynote, you said your view was that we kind of saw nothing better than or different from the competition except marketing and a focus on privacy. And I love something you said was that they showed up to a party without a gift. It was like something we thought just said so much. So what's happened in the last 24 hours?
Well, like I said, they rolled out a bunch of new AI features with a privacy stance, with deep integration into their applications. They didn't bring anything new to the party, but they did it in an Apple way. But the most important part is they showed up to the party, I guess. And it took investors in Wall Street some time to realize that Apple is now here. With or without something new, they've arrived. The concern on Wall Street was that Apple would never show up, or they wouldn't show up for a couple more years from now. But they worked as fast as they can. It was a 1.5 year Herculean effort to get Apple Intelligence to market. They had all these AI features under development, but no synthesized, no integrated package. So it took a while to put it all together.
Okay.
And they did that. And it's not going to sell new iPhones, I believe. It may spur a small number of upgrades, but more importantly, it's going to lock people into the ecosystem. They're going to keep their existing user base, and they're not going to lose people away to Android and other AI-driven platforms because they did this. So it was critically important for them to do it, regardless of the fact that nothing they brought to the table here is especially new.
Mark, why don't you think this is sort of a huge prompt for a super cycle upgrade here? Why don't you think it's as big as adding 5G to the phone, for example?
You know, quite frankly, I didn't think 5G was a super cycle moment either. And it turned out that way. I mean, iPhone sales growth has been stagnant even prior to the 5G iPhone. But like with AI, what 5G did is it kept people within the ecosystem, and it didn't allow people to switch away to rival products that had 5G while Apple didn't. And so AI is in the same nature. It's going to keep people within the ecosystem. I don't think if someone has an iPhone 14 Pro today that they're going to upgrade to the iPhone 16 just because of those AI features, right? I think that down the line, 1 year or 2 from now, when they're ready to upgrade, that's going to ensure that upgrade happens.
I'm going to say that my household were a bunch of tech simpletons because I think the 5G, we did the upgrades on the Apple phones.
Are you still back there? Is that where you are?
I'm at a 12 and I'm getting ready to upgrade this come fall.
I think that makes sense that you'd upgrade from a 12 to a 16.
Tis time. The formal announcement with OpenAI.
Let me jump in. Let me jump in here.
Sure.
If Carol was, really focused on artificial intelligence and wanting the latest and greatest technology, and she has a 12, The 16 comes out later this year with no AI features, right? Maybe she takes a look around and says, AI is all the hype right now. That's the vibe right now. Maybe I should take a look at Samsung or Android, which are completely AI-ified. Now the iPhone has AI, just like the competition, right? Not a ton different, but they're there. And now she says, you know what? Of course I'm going to get this new iPhone. So I don't think it's going to spur upgrades and get people to run out to buy them, but it's going to ensure those people who are already thinking about getting that phone pick that iPhone instead of moving away to Google or Samsung.
And I will say, Mark, and I think we've talked about this before, and like we're a household where it is all Apple. And, my daughter, when she was younger and tried to deviate, we're like, no, that's not happening. So it's like we kind of continue to embrace. I do want to ask you, though, about the partnership with OpenAI, right? The formal announcement, we got that. How important is that? And is it any different from OpenAI's other partnerships that are out there? And is it always different because it's just Apple doing it?
Oh, the OpenAI partnership with Apple is incredibly different. So let me give you some perspective here. So Microsoft, they rolled out a ton of AI features on their computers and their other operating systems for both their in-house devices and third-party devices. The underlying large language models and underlying technology that they're using for nearly all of their features is powered by OpenAI. Apple's feature set, 90% of it is powered by Apple large language models, underlying Apple technology, Apple servers, etc. Only the chatbot portion, primarily, and some of the writing assistance tools, those are powered by OpenAI large language models and ChatGPT. So the OpenAI portion of the overall Apple intelligence story is actually only a very small sliver.
Is it integrated at the OS level? And you can probably guess why I'm asking this, Mark, because
I can guess why you're asking. So let me say a few things about that.
Okay, good. Because, I want to introduce it because I don't think everybody is totally caught up on this. Yesterday, Elon Musk said he would ban Apple devices from his companies if OpenAI's AI software is integrated at the operating system level. He called the tie-up a security risk. Okay, go ahead, please.
Something integrated at the OS level, that is a vague term that can be interpreted in many different ways. So it's not entirely clear what he means by that. If you ask me, OpenAI is indeed integrated at the OS level. And I'm sure Apple would agree, but I'm sure there's some other people who would say that it's not integrated at the OS level. It's built into Siri. It's built into the OS. It's a chatbot. It's not just an application. It's not just a layer on top. It is fairly integrated into the operating system. So I would say, yes, it is integrated. But just because it's integrated at the OS level doesn't mean there aren't parameters and what's known as sandboxing implemented into the coding infrastructure that can separate what goes into ChatGPT from the deeper core of the iOS foundation, right? And so it's up, the burden of proof is on Apple and OpenAI to show how privacy-centric the ChatGPT elements are of Apple Intelligence. Apple did a 15 out of 10 job yesterday showing how private and secure their artificial intelligence technology is for the phone, that's the Apple LLM, how secure their compute cloud is for the LLM that runs in iCloud. They did an amazing job on that. What we didn't hear a lot about is the privacy protections that OpenAI are implementing. From some standpoints, you can say it's just, trust us. Maybe Apple could say a little bit more there. Either way, I think that Elon Musk is competing with Apple and OpenAI here. He has Grok from XAI. He has a terrible interpretation of Apple and feeling towards Apple and their App Store rules and the fees they take from subscriptions on their platform. He clearly does not like Sam Altman, right? He's embroiled in all sorts of things regarding Sam Altman and OpenAI.
He was a co-founder of OpenAI.
He was a co-founder back in the day of OpenAI. They had a falling out. So his perspective isn't exactly kosher on this situation. But he raises real privacy questions regardless. I just think he's way overboard on it.
Okay, that said, Mark, how realistic is it that he could ban these devices at his companies, given that they're ubiquitous? And I can't imagine employees, putting them in some sort of box or leaving them in their cars. They walk into work at SpaceX or the Boring Company or Tesla.
It's a top 10 most ridiculous Elon Musk tweet, right? Okay. That's not going to happen. I mean, imagine showing up to work and all of a sudden, you can't bring your Apple devices in. You have to leave your iPhone in a Faraday cage outside the office or leave it in your car. That's just not going to happen, right? He's already laid off thousands of people from his company, or tens of thousands of people from his company. I'm not sure he can afford to have people quitting in large numbers at this point, but I think that's going to upset a lot of people.
All right, we always talk about the importance of the Chinese market to Apple. Is there something here in terms of what we're hearing from this event and, what they're doing in terms of AI that kind of moves the needle potentially in their sales over in China?
Yes, good question. This is a point that, quite frankly, I should have made earlier. Nothing. Apple Intelligence, at least the first iteration, is only available in U.S. English. Yes, in U.S. English. So there's going to be a long ramp up here until they're able to get it in other languages. Now, let me give you some Apple history. When Siri launched in 2011, it only launched in English and a couple other languages. But 1 year after Siri initially launched, they released so many additional languages. In Siri today, it works in every Chinese dialect. It works in many countries. There's no barrier to using Siri, regardless of where you are in the world in most cases. And I would have to imagine that getting Apple Intelligence to work properly outside of the US, outside of just US English, is going to be a very high priority for next year. Yeah. And so I would anticipate China next year. Now, one other piece of evidence about how Apple sees China, it's going to be one of the first markets to get the Vision Pro this month, just a few months after it came to the US. Right. So clearly they're thinking, US first, right?
Yeah.
China second. And it's not like China's down the list. Right, it's a priority. So I would imagine the AI story for China is going to get buttoned up sooner than later.
Everything we need to know about Apple. Mark Gurman, you rock. Bloomberg News Chief Technology Correspondent Mark Gurman out there in LA. That is our top stock story. The shares of Apple are rallying. We're going to get to our top political story in just a moment.
Hey, let's get a check on the latest world and national news. We got Nancy Lyons in the Bloomberg 99.1 Newsroom in Washington, D.C. Hey, Nance.
Thanks, Tim. Hunter Biden has been found guilty in his federal firearms trial. The son of President Biden was convicted of 3 counts of violating federal gun laws for illegally checking a box on a form stating he was not an active drug user at the time he bought the firearm. Former Assistant U.S. Attorney and Assistant Special Watergate Prosecutor Nick Ackerman says Biden's attorney never should have allowed this case to go to trial.
They had to have known right from the get-go that there were these text messages during the period of time when he signed that form and filled in those boxes and also possessed the gun, even though it was for a short period of time. They knew that there was evidence that Hunter Biden was still addicted and was still taking crack cocaine.
Nick Ackerman speaking with Bloomberg's Balance of Power. 2 of the gun counts carry a prison term as long as 10 years. Another is punishable by as many as 5, though judges rarely impose maximum sentences. President Biden plans to travel to Delaware today. He plans to spend some time with his son, and President Biden says he does respect the jury's verdict. Global news 24 hours a day, and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg.
9:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We've got the S&P 500 index trading very close to session highs right now. Down day for the Dow Industrials, down 131 right now, drop there of 0.3%. S&P up 753.68, on track for a record close if we do advance today, up 0.1%. NASDAQ, the composite index, up 115, now up by about 0.7%. 10-year 4.40%, with a 2-year that's now yielding 4.82%. Gold up $3.50 the ounce to $23.14, up 0.1%. West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.2%, 77.91 for a barrel of WTI. Apple shares pushing higher. Apple at a record, dramatically different story than this time yesterday, up now by 6.5%. And GM shares are advancing up 1.6%. GM has authorized a new $6 billion share buyback plan as improving profitability in its primary business and growth in EVs allows the automaker to return cash to investors. Oracle, after the bell, again recapping, stocks higher, S&P up 9 right now, up 0.2%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. You are up to date on the markets. We do want to get to our top political story at this hour. Hunter Biden found guilty of gun charges by a federal court jury in Delaware, becoming the first child of a sitting U.S. president, Tim, to be convicted of crimes.
A lot of firsts when it comes to politics and legality over the last couple of weeks. With a look at the legal side of the case and the decision and what's next, with us, we got Bloomberg News legal analyst and host of Bloomberg Law, 6 p.m. Wall Street time on Bloomberg Radio, June Grasso here in our studio. June, I do want to ask a little bit about the case and why it was brought by special counsel and U.S. attorney for the District of Delaware. Like, go back to the origin of this before we get to what exactly happened today.
Well, you know, this has been kicking around for years and years and years, and finally, you know, Weiss was appointed, and he started looking into it and brought charges, and there was going to be a plea agreement, which everyone seems to think that this is the kind of case that if you're going to bring it, a plea deal is appropriate here. Right. And there was a plea agreement for this and for the California for the charges of tax evasion. So that was all set, and then they went. You remember? I think I came on that day. They went into Delaware court and said, "We're ready. Here's our deal." And the judge said, "Not so fast." She found certain incongruities and problems with the deal, and it just blew up in their face. Then Weiss asked to be appointed special counsel. And, you know, what extra duties, what extra power do you have? You can bring a case outside of Delaware, because he was in Delaware at that point. He's bringing the case in California, and you can write a report afterwards. So now you have the special counsel, and they brought everything to bear in this case against Hunter Biden. They didn't leave any stone unturned when describing his descent into addiction. You know, they played his they played part of his memoirs.
To be fair, did he break the law?
Well, the jury says yes. The jury says yes. The jury had to believe, and some of the some of the jurors have spoken to CNN, that when he filled out that form, one of the jurors said it definitely, he was on drugs at the time. They thought he knew it.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask. Does accountability mean something different when addiction is also present?
Well, see, that was sort of I think the only hope for the defense here was they were hanging on the fact that 4 of the jurors at least admitted that during jury selection that they had relatives or close friends who had been addicted. And so I think that the defense was saying, look, he was addicted, he didn't knowingly do anything wrong here, but so they were looking for jury nullification. They were looking for a juror to say, 1 or 2 to say, well, we feel bad about him. He shouldn't be sent to prison, which, by the way, one of the jurors said afterwards he shouldn't be sent to prison.
Well, that raises a good question. What is likely for sentencing for a first-time offender here?
So the outer limit is 25 years, which he won't get. So it's possible that he could get no jail time at all, get probation, because he's a first-time offender. He has no history of this, you know. And also there was nothing done in connection with this gun. The gun was put in a box and then, you know, thrown out
away.
and whatever.
Yeah.
So it could be that, or he could get some kind of minimal prison sentence. I listened to one judge I talked to said that maybe a minimal, like 1 year prison sentence or so might be in order. So, it's a lot of calculations go into what a judge decides.
Is an appeal part of that calculations, though, on the defense side?
Well, because he didn't plea, he can take an appeal, and I think that he has some really good issues on appeal. One is a constitutional issue about guns and drug addicts, because the Fifth Circuit has thrown out a law that says that drug addicts can't possess guns, and that's sort of percolating through the system. All these kinds of cases involving guns since the Supreme Court came down with that landmark decision in New York 2 years ago.
Right.
The courts are all in different spots with that. So that might be a constitutional issue where you have groups like the NRA on Hunter Biden's side.
I do want to say we are seeing that President Joe Biden is speaking right now at an Everytown for Gun Safety Gun Sense University conference at the Washington Hilton. We're monitoring that to see if he has any comments about this. I do want to also note that Michael Bloomberg, founder and majority owner of Bloomberg News parent Bloomberg LP, did help found and is a current supporter of Everytown for Gun Safety, which does advocate for gun safety measures.
Our thanks to June Grosso. She's Bloomberg News legal analyst, host of Bloomberg Law. Catch it at 6 p.m. Wall Street time on Bloomberg Radio. All right, so that's what is the legal side of this decision. We want to also get into what it means politically for Hunter's dad. We're talking about President Joe Biden and the November presidential race.
Yeah, with that side of the story, we go down to our Washington, D.C. bureau, where Bloomberg News national politics reporter Hadriana Lowenkron joins us. Certainly living in unusual times, Hadriana, with former President Trump recently being found guilty in the first criminal trial of a former U.S. president in the history of our country, a verdict that could reshape the political landscape. Now, for the first time, a child of a sitting U.S. president to be convicted of crimes. What are the political ramifications of this conviction against Hunter Biden for his father, the current president running for re-election come November?
Right. So, of course, just a slew of unprecedented events taking place in our political landscape here. It's interesting. What's important to note is that this was a trial that really opened, a lot of trauma. It was and sometimes maybe embarrassing, but it was very personal for Hunter Biden and the president, as well as, the entire family. And so there is kind of a question of how does the president address this. He has said in the past that he would not pardon his son if he were to be convicted. He has said that he would respect the verdict, and that has stood true today until at this point where we are right now. But he can, have surrogates who can really frame this as, comparing this with the former president, who, again, as you mentioned, is a convicted felon. He can still kind of make that case if he has his surrogates point to that. He's already, framed the former president as in the race as one, against democracy. And so it'll be interesting to see how he continues to play that and find that balance.
What do you think, or what are you hearing, if anything, from Republican and Democratic political strategists, or maybe from the Biden and Trump camps about what this means for their campaign heading into November?
Right. So, what's important to note here is that we're not really seeing that much movement. I mean, people have, for the most part, made up their minds. There has been polling that suggested that, for the most part, if you're with Trump, you're going to be with Trump. Even after his conviction, he's raised a lot of money off of that, continuing to rally his base. And then Biden, of course, is able to use that conviction to further say, this is a person who is everything that stands, against what democracy is. But, something like this could, continue to, again, rally Biden supporters around him, rally Trump supporters around him. And, we'll see if there's maybe a bit of a movement from some voters who haven't been decided, but strategists really aren't foreseeing that to be too many voters that we're talking about here.
We are definitely living in interesting times, to say the least. And June Grosso just kind of sharing with our team, who we were just talking to, that 3 of the jurors didn't think that the case should have actually been brought. So it's kind of interesting some of the behind-the-scenes stuff.
We'll see what happens on appeal. I do also want to note, Hadriana mentioned the statement from President Joe Biden, who said, quote, "I will accept the outcome of this case and will continue to respect the judicial process as Hunter considers an appeal."
All right, so appreciate the coverage by our team. Hadriana Lowenkron, she is Bloomberg News national politics reporter, joining us in our D.C. bureau. And prior to that, of course, June Grosso, Bloomberg News legal analyst. Catch our broadcast, Bloomberg Law, weeknights, 6 p.m. Wall Street time on Bloomberg Radio. All right, coming up, keeping an eye on the markets, and we're going to get to one of the most read stories on the Bloomberg. That's what we call a deep tease. No, it's actually not a deep tease because it's coming up in just a moment. This is Bloomberg Business Week.
company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. We'll be hearing from Oracle after the close of trading when it reports fiscal fourth quarter results. Investors are expecting that growth in sales from its cloud infrastructure unit will remain high, despite dull results from software peers in recent weeks. Analysts project total sales will increase 5% to $14.6 billion in the 3 months ending in May. Revenue from Oracle's cloud infrastructure unit is expected to increase about 40% in the quarter to $1.97 billion. Right now, we've got Oracle ahead of earnings, trading lower. Oracle right now down by about 0.2%. Apple, what a turnaround from yesterday, up 6.5% right now, 205.60 on Apple. The shares hit their first intraday record since December as investor sentiment around the iPhone maker continues to improve. Now, this stock has risen more than 20% off an April low, a rally that has added more than $500 billion to its market cap and returned it above a $3 trillion level. Apple shares today, they're up now by 6%. 6.4%. General Motors has authorized a new $6 billion share buyback plan, is improving profitability in its primary business, and growth in electric vehicles allow the automaker to return cash to investors. GM says it plans to opportunistically buy its stock under the new program after completing a $10 billion accelerated share repurchase that was approved last November. GM expects to exhaust the remaining $1.1 billion of the prior plan by the end of this quarter. GM shares right now, they're up 1.6%. Those are our top company stories at this hour, and this is Bloomberg.
You're listening to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
It is Bloomberg Business Week. Let's get a check on the latest world and national news. We got Nancy Lyons in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington, D.C. Hey, Nance.
Thanks, Tim. Hunter Biden has been convicted of all 3 felony charges related to the purchase of a gun in 2018. Prosecutors had argued he broke the law when he lied on a mandatory gun purchase form by saying he was not using or addicted to drugs. This is special counsel David Weiss.
No one in this country is above the law. Everyone must be accountable for their actions, even this defendant. However, Hunter Biden should be no more accountable than any other citizen convicted of this same conduct.
Weiss led the long-running federal investigation into Hunter Biden. Biden's attorney says they will continue to vigorously pursue all the legal challenges available. President Biden has said he respects the judicial process. Donald Trump's campaign has reacted to the verdict, saying the trial was nothing more than, quote, a distraction from the real crime. Respects the judicial process. Donald Trump's campaign has reacted to the verdict, saying the trial was nothing more than, quote, a distraction from the real crimes of the Biden crime family. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken is continuing to press for a ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas. Today, he attended a humanitarian conference for Gaza, where he promised more assistance.
I think we all know there is no time to waste, given the hell that hundreds of thousands of Palestinians are enduring every single day.
Secretary Blinken says the only thing standing in the way of a ceasefire at this point is Hamas. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. Now back to you, Tim and Carol.
Thank you so much. Nancy Lyons there in D.C. All right. So NVIDIA began trading yesterday, post the 1 for 10, 10 for 1.
Yeah, exactly.
10 for 1 stock split.
Yes.
Big deal. But it's interesting. There's a story that we've been tracking on the Bloomberg that has to do with maybe the next company where we might see a massive stock split.
Drum roll, please.
Da, 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 da. That's not a drum roll.
Could it be Meta Platforms? At least some analysts are pointing to it. The company formerly known as Facebook is the only stock in the so-called Mag 7 that hasn't ever split shares. And though the stock is off all-time highs that it hit just back in April, it's still up more than 450% from that trough of 2022.
Yeah, Ken Mahoney is president of a firm that bears his name, referring to what's seen as a key level for investors. He says trading at more than $500 a share. Yeah, Meta is right for a split. That's his quote. He says the stock has benefited from the appetite for AI exposure, buybacks, and the introduction of a dividend in the past year. I mean, shares of Meta, they're just up slightly, up about 0.6%, but they are up 43% alone in 2024, as you were just kind of talking about the run-up.
Okay, I'm going to get on my soapbox about stock splits.
Please do it.
Stock prices.
Does it mean really anything?
For years, the idea was that it meant a lot to retail investors.
Made it more accessible, right?
It made it more accessible.
Affordable.
But on these brokerage platforms, you can buy fractional shares of stock. So it's not as big of a deal as it used to be. You could go buy a piece of Apple. You could go buy a piece of Meta Platforms. You could go buy a piece of Berkshire Hathaway.
Right.
If you wanted to, if you can't buy a full share. So I don't know if the making it more appealing for retail investors still holds as much weight as it used to.
Fundamentals, though,
do not
change.
The fundamentals do not change.
So it's just something to think about as, we kind of watch and wait to see could possibly happen to Meta. So we'll see. It's on our radar, that's for sure. Also on our radar is what's coming up in the next couple of hours on Bloomberg Business Week. For those watching on television, the close is coming your way in just a moment. Meantime, for those of us on radio, YouTube, and Bloomberg Originals, we're going to continue to talk about the Fed. It really is about what we get from that CPI print. As we heard from our Steve Matthews, the Fed could get that CPI print, could be a hot one, and they rethink that dot plot. But we're going to see what our own Michael McKenzie has to say about it.
Also, another check on what Apple shares are doing, a postmortem on Apple Intelligence with Bloomberg Intelligence. And how about a new luxury condo, Carol?
No thanks.
Okay.
I got enough on my hands. We're also going to talk to the author of Holding It Together. A lot coming your way. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio.
And a very good afternoon, everybody. We are just 1 hour away from the closing bell on this Tuesday, June 11th, 2024. Carol Masser, along with Tim Stenivek, live in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio. Still top of mind is, of course, the Fed meeting tomorrow, but also that inflation print tomorrow.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's certainly front and center, those two things, as the Fed kicks off its two-day policy meeting, how American businesses are dealing with higher for longer.
Yeah, we're going to look at that angle as well, because it's interesting in terms of what we're seeing. We mentioned in the last hour, Apple shares at a record.
Is that one of your gainers?
It is.
Okay,
First one.
tease.
We've got a postmortem on Apple Intelligence with Bloomberg Intelligence. We're going to get kind of a lowdown of fundamentally the Apple story. We got some great stuff from Mark Gurman last hour, but our own Anurag Rana is going to stop by.
Okay, you might not be in the market for a new condo.
Nope.
But if you are, we are doing a check on New York City luxury real estate. We got Brown Harris Stevens, Louise Phillip Forbes. She's been doing this for over 30 years, sold transactions that have valued $5.5 billion in real estate through her career. So
She's seen a lot.
Seen a lot on the island of Manhattan.
Curious what she says about the cycle right now, especially in this rate environment. And also we're going to get into how women became America's safety net. Love this. It's a topic of a new book, so that's coming up in just a moment. First up, though, let's get to your top business stories on this Tuesday and look at the trade. Here's once again Charlie Pellet.
Hi, thank you very much. We are looking at potential records here. Final hour of trading on this Tuesday now. 58 minutes to go. We have got the S&P up 853.69, a gain of 0.2%. To be sure, any advance today in both the S&P and NASDAQ would be another record. NASDAQ right now surging 114 points, up by about 0.7%. The Dow, though, in the red, down 123 right now, a decline of 0.3%. 10-year 4.40% with a 2-year 4.83%. Gold up $3.50 the ounce to $23.14, up 0.1%. And West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.2%, $77.93 for a barrel of WTI. Treasuries climbed. Stocks rebounded from session lows after a solid $39 billion U.S. government sale. Traders getting ready for a key inflation reading and the Federal Reserve decision. As for the Fed and what to expect longer term, Lauren Goodwin is Chief Market Strategist at New York Life Investments.
I think that they're trying really hard to walk this tightrope between really where they sit right now, which is that the data are slowing. They believe they're restrictive, but they want to make sure that that doesn't turn into a policy mistake of being restrictive for too long.
Lauren Goodwin with New York Life Investments. Our Michael McKee will have a whole lot more coming up on the Fed in just a moment. Banks hard hit today, weighing on the Dow. JP Morgan Chase now down 2.5%. Citigroup tumbling 3.4%. Wells Fargo shares down by 0.8%. Recapping, we're looking at a mixed day for the U.S. equity market. The S&P holding on to a 9-point gain right now, up 0.2%. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Hey, thank you so much for that update, Charlie Pellet. Do appreciate it. Well, as you know, top of our agenda today is the Fed's two-day policy meeting. Kicks off today. We're going to bring you Jay Powell's press conference live tomorrow, of course. The Fed widely expected to hold borrowing costs at a 2-decade high, but there is less certainty on officials' quarterly rate projections, known, of course, as the dot plot. Oh, and then, of course, there's the latest read on inflation with CPI just hours ahead of that press conference. To that end, as we mentioned earlier, bond traders who have come to terms with the prospect of higher for longer rates through 2024 are looking toward that Fed meeting for clues on how to game out 2025 and beyond. Writing about that today is Bloomberg News rates reporter Michael McKenzie. He joins us here in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. So we started the year thinking that there would be, well, I don't want to say we, but the market. The market.
The wisdom of the market.
The wisdom of the market said, all right, dovish talk in December, 6 rate cuts, that's what we're going to see.
Yep.
We saw bonds do what they did.
Yep.
Now here we are, wow, 6 months through the year, 0 rate cuts so far. Maybe we'll get 2. maybe one, maybe none.
Well,
What do you
the market's learned its lesson. The market's basically pricing about, what, 1.5 rate cuts, if that?
Okay.
And I think that's pretty fair value now, because we've had some very solid inflation prints. It's clearly sticky. Tomorrow, even if it comes in as expected, it's still going to be well above the Fed's comfort zone. And the Fed itself will look at a number tomorrow that comes in as expected and say, well, we're probably going to need at least another 3 months before we can really be sure about this, that it is trending in the right direction. So that gets you towards maybe September, which currently right now is a coin toss with about 12 basis points priced in. But it could easily be a case where they may not be able to go in September unless the data really cooperates. And that's really the problem that's facing the bond market here, because all these traders and investors with different time horizons are trying to work out, okay, where should I be investing? What part of the curve should I be on? All they really know for sure is that tomorrow could potentially be a very violent whipsaw, as a bond investor just told me on the phone about 30 minutes ago. You've got CPI, you then got the Fed statement, you then got the summary of economic projections, then you've got Powell's press conference. It's just a litany of events coming tomorrow. And as he also explained, and this is also what people at BlackRock were telling me earlier this week, every data point now is a source of volatility for the market. And so it's not going to be a quiet summer. This idea that after tomorrow, maybe we can settle down, maybe not. So I think it's a lot in play.
Sit on the beach, read a nice book.
Yeah.
Not going to happen.
You might not be going fishing.
Make sure you have all your devices, whether it's on a fishing boat or on the beach. Yeah. Having said that, Michael, could we see a day where the inflation print potentially comes in hot, and then the Fed is kind of more subdued in terms of a fight against inflation, where they say, well, that was just one, I'm just curious if we could see some cross currents in what in the inflation report is, what the Fed says, and what we get from Jay Powell. And the summary of economic
I think
projections.
you've nailed that, because I think that's what's bugging everybody at the back of their minds, so they think about tomorrow, because you could have a scenario where people are going to look at the dots, but they're also going to look at where does the Fed expect inflation to be heading by the end of this year and by the end of next year. So those are things that they're going to be looking for. Then, of course, Powell will do his press conference, and Powell tends to be a bit more dovish more often than not. So how's he going to, he pushed back against the first 3 months of hotter inflation prints, which kind of surprised a few people in the bond market. Can he keep doing that if tomorrow's data is on the hotter side? So I think that's all in play, and it's just going to add to the churn that we're seeing in markets on any kind of data point.
How are you thinking, or how are the folks you speak to each and every day thinking about the range of yields going into this and after this?
Yeah, so spoke to Vanguard this afternoon, and they sort of said, if twos get back to 5%, that's great value. If you look at the 10-year, it's a 425, 475 market. We saw a very good auction today. A lot of demand came in around that 443, which is kind of in the middle of the range. And again, the other thing I'd say about the auctions they are liquidity events. If you want to buy a lot of 10-year paper, you can do that at the auction rather than relying on the secondary market. So maybe a sort of sense of that.
Does a good auction, though, say to you that, okay, maybe traders are thinking that yields have topped out again?
Potentially. We did get a sell-off after payrolls on Friday.
Right.
We backed up towards the 450 area. That seems to be where people like buying and nibbling away at 10s. And I think the twos last week got towards 5%, kind of come off a bit since then. But that seems to be, those are the buying areas, I think, for this market. And so we'll see.
I'm surprised to hear you say 475. It seems kind of high given where we were in the last couple of weeks.
I think if you look at the general tone of the labor market, wages picking up last week. I know a lot of people dispute whether wages follow inflation, and that's a whole academic debate there. But there's enough to suggest, I think, that if the data continues to come in on the stronger side, you could see a run towards 475. I'd also say it is coming on the attention of a lot of people I speak to on their radar screens that the election is looming into view. And again, the spending, all the various proposals, the risk that you could see one party sweep Congress and the White House opens the floodgates to more spending. So again, 10 years gets you into that uncomfortable zone where if you look at it on various Fed models, there is no term premium. It's not positive. So if we get more volatility as we get closer to the election, you're going to see more term premium coming back into the market. So again, you could see we get to 475, I think. I wouldn't rule that out. I don't think anyone can.
Okay. What's interesting for you about kind of this world right now? You've seen cycles, we've done this before, but it does feel a little weird where I keep hearing people say softness, concerns about the data, certainly on the labor side, conflicting and trying to really understand, is the Fed getting behind the curve? At the same time, you've got people saying, well, don't rule out a rate increase because of inflationary pressure. So your expertise and what's kind of interesting about...
Well, I think what's interesting to me is that I can see similarities with the 2019 period when the economy was slowing and the Fed eventually did 2 cuts that year. And then, of course, after that, we had COVID. I could also see similarities with the summer of 2007 when you were beginning to see problems. And I think of the commercial real estate. I think of PIMCO today saying, we think regional banks have still got problems. This is coming home to roost. So there's sort of tremors of that. But then I also think back to 95, 96, when the internet boom really got going, when productivity. So there's all these different cross currents. I mean, it really is a fascinating time because it's got a bit of everything. And when you talk to bond investors, particularly those who were around in the 90s, that's what they keep coming back to. No one really knows what is the paradigm to be following at the moment. And it's compounded when every time you get an economist coming onto surveillance in the morning saying, my model's broken. I don't know what's going on, because they can't explain the divergence in the soft and the hard data, what's backward looking,
If only we'd
what's
had more
forward-looking.
pandemics and the economy shutting down,
no
we could
idea.
kind of understand where we go from
still
here.
in that uncharted territory.
Or
though,
something to that effect. Michael McKenzie, thank you. We're going to be looking forward to reading your stuff post-Fed tomorrow. He's our rates reporter here at Bloomberg News, joining us right here in our studio. All right, so now we want to get to the Fed's higher for longer or high for longer stance and how that's going to hit firms that were really, Tim, counting on that Fed rate cut, at the beginning of the year and certainly late last year.
It leads us to a most read story on the Bloomberg terminal and how American businesses and consumers started the year thinking interest rates would finally come down, making big plans to buy equipment, maybe finally buy that first home. Now, all of that is on hold, slowing large swaths of the economy for the foreseeable future.
For more, we welcome Mark Niquette. He's Bloomberg News Real Economy Team reporter. He joins us from Columbus, Ohio. Mark, so glad we could have you here because it's a story that terminal folks are reading. It's important. Tell us about kind of, the great 180 that has been expectations about rates and what was going to happen and what it means for individuals, for businesses. I mean, the change from expecting, 5-6 cuts at the end of last year, beginning of this year, to now people talking about maybe even another rate increase. It's a big deal for businesses.
Yeah, if you think back to the December timeframe after Chairman Powell's press conference that month, the expectations were we were going to have multiple rate cuts in 2024, including in the first quarter. And we saw projections like the Institute for Supply Management does a semi-annual survey of manufacturers. They were expecting like a 12% increase in capital expenditure investments. So we had companies planning to do CapEx, hiring, investments, all on the assumption that there would be lower borrowing costs and improved economy with Fed rate cuts, and it didn't happen. So we've seen companies cutting back and delaying purchases and investments. The ISM semi-annual survey update in May put the expected increase in capital expenditures at 1% from 12% in December. So clearly we're seeing companies shy about spending money with higher borrowing costs not coming down anytime soon.
I mean, Mark, this is by design, though. This is exactly what is supposed to happen when the Fed raises rates. The issue, though, that we've seen, and I think it hits consumers too who are looking for a new home because it hits them with that mortgage rate, is that typically in situations like this, the higher rate, which leads to a pullback in spending, leads prices to come down or not accelerate as quickly as they were. That has not happened.
You're right, and the Fed, Chairman Powell will say that we're all going to be better off if inflation comes down and costs are lower, particularly for folks on the lower income side of the spectrum. But in the meantime, you have businesses that are trying to do planning, long-range planning, and in some cases, small businesses that have adjustable rate mortgages that are coming due. faced with the prospect of, how do they handle these higher borrowing costs? And we're seeing, like I said, delayed investments, delayed expansions. Businesses trying to grapple with the fact that, they're not going to see lower borrowing costs anytime soon.
What's the, you keep talking about kind of smaller businesses, and, we certainly get into this in terms of the market environment, large caps versus small caps, but this is something that really weighs on smaller businesses, correct, in terms of the rate environment and what it means for what they can do. Larger businesses, we talk about AI, people are spending on chips and doing things because if you're a large player, you want to make sure you're in the game. But for smaller businesses, often it's, I feel like small business paycheck to small business paycheck, like it's a lot leaner and meaner. It's more difficult.
Right. And in fact, we saw a new data point on that this morning. The NFIB came out with its monthly sentiment index numbers, and it showed that 6% of businesses said the top concern was borrowing costs, financing costs, which was like the highest number in 14 years in that NFIB survey. So clearly, this is a challenge for small businesses, and like you said, weighing more heavily on them, large businesses.
What about for U.S. households? To what extent is the challenge falling on U.S. households? We talk about this a lot in the context of mortgages, and that so many Americans who do own homes are locked in at a rate that is under 4%, which looks really, really good, especially right now. But what about the cost of servicing the other debt that households have?
Yeah, any kind of consumer debt is going to be affected, right? Credit cards, student loans, auto loans, and we're seeing, elevated defaults in those areas. It's just more expensive to buy a car and finance it. And folks who have, credit card debt, might have expected to see their interest rates come down if the Fed cut interest rates, if they're tied to the prime rate. That hasn't happened. So, folks with high credit card balances are even more burdened. And, we talked to a lot of homeowners who went into the year thinking, hey, this was a good time to buy a home. Mortgage rates were coming down. The expectation was that, Fed rate cuts would bring those rates down further. And, we talked to homeowners who even found the home that they wanted to buy, fit the bill of, a larger home, whatever the circumstances were. And they ultimately put off that purchase because, with interest rates, mortgage rates staying high, they were looking at their mortgage doubling. So, particularly like you said, if they were locked in at a low interest mortgage, it made no sense for them to buy a new home and move. So, we've seen multiple impacts on consumers, from the standpoint of, what their consumer debt situation looks like, or even if you're a, well-off homeowner, not being able to move because, the cost is just too high.
Right, and the uncertainty. We were just talking with our Michael McKenzie following the rates market, but the idea that there's so many conflicting data points that there's a point where you're like, I'm not going to do anything until I get some clarity about the future, whether I'm a small business owner, whether I'm an individual or a consumer, you really just kind of get stuck. So glad we could catch some time with you. Mark, thank you so much. Mark Niquette, he's Real Economy team reporter at Bloomberg News. As we mentioned, this is one of the most read stories, Tim, today on the Bloomberg Terminal.
Well, from the real economy to the New York City economy, especially when it comes to luxury real estate. That's what we're going to be diving into. It certainly is the other end. But interestingly enough, high rates may still be an issue for buyers, even at the top end of the range.
Which is super interesting. So we're going to tackle that. That's coming up next on Bloomberg Business Week. I'm Carol Massar along with Tim Stanovic, and this is Bloomberg.
It's 3:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow Jones Industrial Average in the red ahead of the close. 39 minutes to go. S&P 500 index up 4 right now. Any advance today for both the S&P and NASDAQ will be a record. S&P right now up 4, up 0.1%, 53.65. NASDAQ up 104 for the NASDAQ Composite Index, a gain right now of 0.6%. So a decidedly mixed market. The Dow lower, S&P, NASDAQ, they're both higher. 10-year yield 4.39% with a 2-year 4.82%. Gold up 0.1%, 23.14 the ounce. And West Texas Intermediate crude oil up 0.2%, 77.87 for a barrel of WTI. Next up for investors, the big event, the Fed decision tomorrow, 2 p.m. Wall Street time. Perhaps more importantly, Jay Powell's news conference.